to become who we want to be as individuals. And at the end of the day, that's going to help us be a successful offense.
Man-to-man, one-on-one coverage because the safety rolls to Jefferson's side.
Jordan Love hit me up the night of the draft, just congratulating me, let me know it's time to work. A.J. Dillon was open arms.
Monrock caught a ball with his thighs. We didn't even talk about that.
It was more of with his ass.
If he throws a good ball, this is a running, catching touchdown untouched.
Like, KP does like these flips after every win, and I'm like just waiting for him to do his flip.
To know that we still love each other, that's what football brings us.
Across the safety's face.
You can tune in anywhere that you guys follow us on social media. Welcome to the Practice Squad podcast. Holy shit, I made the music way too loud. That's my bad. I can never nail that, man. My name is John. I'm joined with my co-host Mark, and you are watching episode 51, but more importantly, it's the fantasy football special. So if you're new to the show, Mark and I both won our leagues last year. We are competitive all the time, year in and year out. And we put a lot of work into kind of sharing our opinions and perspectives going into the season. And then this Thursday, Friday, I don't know if we've decided on a day yet, we're also going to do a live stream mock draft. So Mark, how are you feeling? I'm sure you're amped for this episode like I am.
I'm very excited for this episode. And like John said, we did both win our fantasy league last year. We're not just coming to you and just saying, hey, here's the answers to the test. Go take it and get an A. We have evidence to back up our claims in this episode. We've both been fantasy players for a long time, and we've learned a lot along the way. We've had some losing years, but I think the last 4 or 5 years, John and I have both been relevant in our leagues and top dogs last year. So hoping to do the same thing. A lot of different ways that you can draft, a lot of different players that you can get in later rounds that we're going to help you out with. I'll say this, it's a lot easier to screw up a fantasy draft than it is to steal one, right? So you want to be on the stealing side, get the players late that people are thinking of, and you don't want to take the guys that is too obvious, when there's a lot of risk. And we'll try to help you out as we go through this episode.
Yeah, and then look, much easier said than done. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty. Some of our opinions could blow up in our face. I think most of the ones we made last year kind of aged well. And then obviously, like when you're drafting, man, like, you're always like being, the 7th pick rather than the 6th away from getting screwed over out of all your guys. And I think knowing how to adjust on the fly and, kind of pivot, have a decent laundry list of guys, decent depth chart going obviously helps a lot too. Before we get into that, we're also going to just, hit on some of the training camp topics. We're finally at that point where there's a little drama stirring around the league because, training camp's happening and people are starting to show up and talk their shit and argue for their contracts and all that good stuff. So first things first is Sean Payton had some choice words about the job that Nathaniel Hackett did. He's walked the comments back, but man, like these weren't just like video clips taken out of context that he kind of said flippantly. Like he was in an interview and he said he like put on his Fox News pundit hat a little too hard. Brutal comments. Like
there's no excuse for it, John. I already posted a short about it, and people are very opinionated on this topic. The simple thing is this: there's a respect once you've made it to that level as a coach in the NFL. I don't care if you're a good coach or a bad coach. You're coaching the NFL, and there's a level of respect. And a lot of the times, there's so many overlap. And there's one day Hackett could be coaching with Sean Payton. Like you just never know what the dynamic's going to be ever. Coaches get recycled in that league. It's a mutual respect thing. And Hackett did a terrible job in Denver last year. No one is denying that. But for another coach to come out of his short little retirement from being in the media train and then come back into coaching and basically say, well, last year was so shitty because he was such a bad coach, to another coach, to say that publicly about another coach that's still in the league and relevant in the league. One, Sean Payton gets nothing out of it because if he doesn't succeed in Denver, he looks like an even bigger idiot.
And they play each other in week 5.
And they play each other. So, hey, bulletin board material, never a good idea. And then, obviously, too, just like Sean Payton's been around the league for a very long time. He's not perfect, right? A lot of people got in the comments on my video. I called him a relatively decent coach in terms of how he carries himself. Bountygate and all that shit was brought up a bunch of times. He's not perfect either, right? But how many of these coaches in the NFL are? right? A lot of them have some kind of dark history. Even Belichick, one of the best of all time, has, all these different scandals that you could, mention when you hear his name. So you can't do it. Aaron Rodgers came out and defended his coach. I loved that. And he didn't have to take Sean Payton down to do it. He just said, if you're that insecure where you have to put another grown man down, obviously you have some things you need to address about yourself. And that was, I think, the best way of saying it.
And again, I don't know if it's, him trying to create a fallback where, if Denver is a non-playoff team next year, he can be it's because the job was so bad last year.
It doesn't make sense, because it's like, he basically said it's not Russell Wilson's fault. It's not the team's fault. It's the coach's fault. So if Denver doesn't win 10 games, what are we going to say? It's the coach's fault again? Because then I'm sure Sean Payton will say, hey, get me a new quarterback. This guy stinks if they win 4 games, which is possible. I mean, Russell Wilson was awful. He wasn't even a top 32 quarterback last year. He was terrible.
It's very interesting situation, and I think Peyton has a lot on his plate that he's going to need to fix over there, and some of that will actually feed into some of the conversation that's happening fantasy-wise right now. Another big topic now is Jonathan Taylor.
This running back thing never ends, man.
Yeah, and it
feels like every episode we have a new running back drama, all stemming from the same idea that they're undervalued.
Yeah, it's And I don't disagree, right? Jonathan Taylor is one of the better backs, but I think coming off of an injury year and after already kind of, re-signing with the Colts and all of that, and, right off the heels of getting a new agent, not a lot of leverage with him. And then I think the best take that I've heard on this is, Lombardi came on to Pat McAfee show today and is like, hey, you got to remember who you're talking to in these situations. And this is crazy Uncle Jim Irsay, who, when words come out of his mouth, he's not going to take them back, right? This is one of the most stubborn old man owners in all of the NFL at this point. And do they have the money to pay Jonathan Taylor $16 million a year? 100%. Would it actually make sense for them to, especially since they're trying to upgrade their offensive line? They have a question mark at quarterback, and they don't have a ton of weapons around him. 100%. But because Irsay basically came out and said, that's not what we're, having running backs, what we're willing to pay running backs, he's not going to take it back at this point.
And here's the thing. Most people around the league agree with Jim Irsay's thought process as to why not to pay Jonathan Taylor, but most of them just won't come out and blatantly say it like that. I mean, he basically said, you're worth nothing. If you left this league, no one would remember or care about you. It was essentially what he said publicly about Jonathan Taylor, who's one of the biggest names at the running back position in the NFL.
Airing out his dirty laundry like that on Twitter was wild. The part that had me scratching my head, and conspiracy theory time, I actually wrote a tweet out about it, sent it, looked back the next day, why didn't it get any interaction with it? And it actually failed to send and wasn't in my drafts anymore. And I was like, all right, I guess the Irsay hackers came in and took it down. But I guess I pretty much was like, okay, you have a post where you say, CBA players, all these things came together for a reason. And this is why we have the structure that we do. And it's a good structure. It protects the players, it protects the franchises and their owners and their managers. It's good for everybody. And then damn near the exact next threat that he makes is, we're going to use your fake back injury to put you on the NFL list so that you don't get paid at all this year. It's just the juxtaposition of CBA, this is good for the players, and then we are going to ruin your life through a loophole in the CBA.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
just wild behavior.
This won't be the last conversation we have about owners and running backs and their value, and it just seems like this thing's never ending, and we just circle back each week, and who knows what's going to happen in the next week when we come back for next week's episode. And I'm sure we'll have another update with a different player that had an issue with their value. Because there are several others. There are several other running back free agents that are out there. Dalvin Cook, Leonard Fournette, Kareem Hunt, Zeke Elliott, some of these guys that are still not on teams. And the only reason I can think that, if that's the case is because they're asking for too much money. And
I could very well see, one of them signing to the Colts overnight just as an FU to Jonathan Taylor. And Irsay would totally be the type to go and pay them probably more than they're worth, $6-7 million.
Just to spite someone.
Just to spite Jonathan Taylor.
And listen, and the sad thing is, honestly, unfortunately, that's the smart move to do as an owner, is to go get one of those guys, pay him about half as much as Jonathan Taylor's going to ask, and you'll get probably more than 50% of the production Jonathan Taylor brings. So that's the whole balance that never ends with
And this is why the running back's a tough position, because even though it's important, there's one, maybe two on the field at any given point in time. So you only need 3 on your depth chart, which is damn near the same number of quarterbacks that an average team has on their depth chart, versus wide receivers where there's 8 guys on the depth chart, right? And it's very hard to be able to bid up your price when there's not a whole lot of demand for your position, despite how good you are. So another thing I want to hop to real quick. So I said this to Mark when we got on stream preparing for the episode. Like, I love seeing like practice rivalries start, right? At training camp, and you start seeing players that are going to be like boys, like in the locker room when the season actually starts. They're at each other's throats right now because they're trying to make the team, impress their coaches, and all that stuff. So this is George Pickens, and this is a little fantasy foreshadowing as well, because I think this dude is going to be huge for the Steelers this year, going up against Joey Porter Jr., and just the shit talking that takes place, the celebration, the catch that happens here.
Well,
awesome.
John, what's the saying? Is it iron sharpens iron, or is it steel sharpens steel? Because the Steelers they're competing at practice. And George Pickens, obviously, he's made plays like this at, in college, and we've seen videos of him go viral, and he does this weird shit. And the celebration is, just terrible. If I'm Mike Tomlin, I'm getting in that dude's face, because you make a great play. And first of all, this is pretty damn good coverage by
and an amazing catch.
An amazing play, but you don't do that. You don't taunt the player directly like that. You can get up and celebrate with your teammates and shit. I'm all one for like a cool touchdown dance and all that stuff, but to just taunt somebody like that is your teammate that you're working to compete with and get better every day, like, this is bullshit. I get you made a great play, but that is bullshit.
See, I'm just going to say it. This doesn't bother me at all. I don't think it's going to be all that bad between Pickens and Porter Jr. I think they're going to be buddies in the season. It's practice. There's fans there. He's trying to put on a show. I think it's sweet. Like, if you want to talk about like Jameson Williams throwing a punch at an undrafted cornerback because he's frustrated with how he's getting covered, that's a different story. This, it's trash talking, it's cocky, but I think it's fun. So
there's trash talking, and then there's deliberately taunting someone like this, and I think that's over the top.
I don't know. I think, man, it's the NFL. People are going to do shit like that to you.
That's a penalty on a Sunday, John.
Yeah, that's fair. And then the other thing I want to show here quickly is, the Lions released the inside of the den for the draft, which was long awaited. Obviously, we're 4 months post draft, and they just posted it. One, it was awesome, and huge shout out to that team's production team, because they year in, year out put out some really killer content for fans to watch. But one of my favorite parts was just listening to Brad Holmes kind of defend his picks, especially his first round picks. And this entire documentary series has kind of become like here's the guys that we got, here's the rationale behind it, and these are the receipts for you to hold us accountable to that in the future. Really cool seeing guys like Kirby Joseph and Malcolm Rodriguez end up panning out and being starters on the team when that was the rationale that was given on why they were picked in those later rounds. Same goes for guys like Amon-Ra in years prior. But anyways, Jack Campbell here, Brad Holmes pretty much mentions this one play. And, you can have questions about his lateral movement or his speed or his ability to cover, but you're not going to have questions about his football IQ, because just how he adjusts his body in this particular play is incredible. Just recognizing what's happening and then dropping into the flat to make Stroud actually have to think a little bit more about what he's doing. And he gets right in there and is able to make an interception off of it.
And really, John, what's the most impressive thing, and they talk about this in the Inside the Den, is he took away 3 options in one play just by his awareness, not by being an athlete, not by being, the best player on the field in that moment, just by his awareness and film study and understanding of what Ohio State was trying to do on this specific play in this situation. He was able to take away all 3 of Stroud's options, force him to hold the ball, throw it late, and then still get to the third read of this progression and make an interception. So, Again, I have some questions marks, with Jack Campbell and how his game will translate early on with the Lions. I thought he was drafted a little bit too high. I thought it was a bit of a reach, and I still think that. But there's no doubt that his football IQ, his awareness as a linebacker, and he's got this playmaking ability that he was consistently making these kinds of plays at Iowa. I don't know how it translates. I'm curious to see. I have some questions, but you can't doubt plays like this are special.
Yeah, I personally, I'm very confident that the Lions are going to be running a whole lot of nickel. And so that need for like a coverage linebacker decreases. And like, he's not covering anybody in this. He's just dropping back and having good position on the field. And as you said, Mark, he's taking away a ton of options just by his placement on the field. He's not running directly alongside anybody, trying to cover anybody. He's just keeping really good position on the field in reference to where the other defenders are at. And it paid off here. So I'm hoping that, with guys like CJ and Brian Branch, in their nickel position, which is, where a lot of those guys are comfortable, that he can just be let loose to do shit like this. Also hear that they've ran him at edge a couple times just for fun, which I think is pretty interesting. So, anyways, that's pretty much covering all of the non-fantasy football topics that we want to cover for this episode, kind of in record time here. So, Mark, are we ready?
Love to get here into the fantasy world, man. Did you steal that font from the Looney Tunes?
Yeah, actually. Well, I was trying to keep the branding going with our whole like practice squad.
Beautiful. Logo. I love it, John. I'm just giving you shit. I know.
I know. And I know that your graphic design skills aren't, anywhere near where mine's at. So
not good.
But hey, you do make good hype videos though. So
that's true.
All right. So I guess one kind of concept that we're going to introduce here, but you're going to hear more about it at the end of the conversation rather than the beginning, because we're going to start this off with just, who are our top 5 players at each position. But the practice squad pod fantasy score is going to be an average score out of 10 using kind of these 3 factors. 1, situation. So that's just basically, how does the role within their team impact their potential, right? For example, if you're a tight end, right, how much of a red zone target are you with the scheme of your team? That obviously is going to matter quite a bit, especially when we start talking about, like I said, rookies and sleepers kind of later in the presentation here.
And there's tons of, and the situation's big, right? Like, are you a team that plays from behind a lot? Are you on a bad football team that throws the ball a lot and you're a receiver that's going to get more targets because of that, right? Matthew Stafford for years was a fantasy stud because in Detroit they were losing always, and he was always throwing to try to keep them in the game.
Right.
Free agency moves, coaching changes, all of that stuff goes into situation.
Skill then, which is basically just past season performance. We were just going to call this past season, but one of the 3 S's, kind of works well. Not shit, shower, shave, but situation, skill.
Don't overthink it. How are they playing the position that they're at? Sometimes you got to just look at that.
Exactly. And you can factor past season into that, but I mean, at the end of the day, you have a pretty good read on what a player is going to do for their team going into the season. And then schedule, right? Who do they match up well with? And obviously, like, strength of schedule is a factor here, but also divisional opponents. Who are you going to be seeing,
right.
twice a year?
You're going to see often,
well, right?
And more so, what are the strengths of the teams that you're going against, right? Do you want to draft a quarterback that plays against 3 really good defenses twice a year, or do you want to draft a quarterback that's in a shitty division where you're going to have shootout games and a ton of yards, ton of touchdowns, stuff like that? So you want to look at not only just how good are the teams they're playing, but where are those teams that they're playing's weaknesses? And you want those weaknesses specifically to be like what the Vikings defense was last year. They couldn't, cover anybody.
Yeah. And it's something that you really want to consider. Mark just mentioned passing game and Vikings, defense, but also, some running backs, man, their production is based purely on the line in front of them and the line that they're running against. And you'll see some guys get 15, 16 points because they're playing against a shitty defensive line one week, and then they'll get 3 points the next week because they're playing against a better defensive line. So it's really important to consider that. So those are kind of the 3 factors. Like I said, you're going to hear us probably throw like scores out there later, more in the rookies and the sleepers, but just something to keep in mind as we kind of go into this discussion. So first position group, we got running backs. Mark, I'll let you kind of take the microphone here and kind of go through your top 5 running backs going to the season.
Sure. So I'll start with my 5th and I'll work my way up. So at 5, I had Joe Mixon. They lost Pirine out of Cincinnati, so I figured that a number of touches would go up. They continue to use him more and more as a receiver as he advances with Joe Burrow. The more that Joe Burrow just picks defenses apart, the more I think he's going to become like Tom Brady, where he's going to hit his check down more often because they're trying to take away the home run balls to T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. So Joe Mixon should get more catches this year. And then obviously he's their workhorse in the running game. So I have him in there. His high is high. Last year he had a 5-touchdown game, so he can definitely do that for you. And his low isn't that bad, right? I mean, 10 points, 12 points maybe are the worst you're going to see him. And he's always healthy, right? He's always healthy is another big thing. At 4, I had Tony Pollard. Obviously, the absence of Zeke. He's now the guy in Dallas. You saw what he did as a number 2 back, and I put quotations, number 2 back last year. Now he's the guy, right? He is the man behind a Dallas team that obviously relies on the running game first. They have a good run game because of their O-line. They have a good system. And I trust that he's going to get some screen game and stuff like that as well. So look for him to have a huge year in Dallas because we've seen it as a number 2 what he does, and as a number 1, I just expect it to get better. Number 3, I have Nick Chubb. No Kareem Hunt. Notice a common trend here. These first 3 guys I just mentioned, their co-part, right, or that running back by committee is absent. So I expect, obviously, there'll still be some kind of a committee, but not as much. So Nick Chubb, I have at 3rd. I think that with Deshaun Watson opening up the pass game, he'll see some lighter boxes. And we saw what he's done against heavy boxes with Baker Mayfield, guys like that at quarterback. So I anticipate him to just have a huge year. He's a goal line nightmare because he can score. No matter how many guys get hands on him, he'll break tackles. He'll get in the end zone. The guy squats like 1,000,000 pounds. So he's also got home run ability. We've seen him break 70-yard touchdowns several times throughout his career. And at 2, I have McCaffrey. Now, this is where a lot of debate will stir. A lot of guys will have McCaffrey as their number 1 guy in fantasy. It's been that way for some years now because of his ability as a receiving running back. He was kind of the first guy in the PPR world of fantasy football to just kind of steal the show. Like when he was with Carolina, I mean, he was so much higher targeted as a running back than anyone else in the passing game that it became like this guy's getting like
cheat code. 35 points.
People in fantasy leagues were like, do we list this guy as a receiver? Like we this is unfair. He's so much better in terms of catching the ball than everyone else. But the league's adapted, and now you have guys like Eckler and even guys like Mixon and Pollard are catching the ball in the backfield a lot. So it's changed a little bit, but I do anticipate McCaffrey to have a huge year with San Francisco because of how they run the ball. We saw what he did in the playoffs last year. He was only there for like a couple months and just thrived. So now he's got an entire offseason. They got the entire offseason, a game plan for him and use him in a lot of different ways. He's going to be huge for San Francisco. The big question always, and part of why I have him at 2, not 1, the health, right? He always has health concerns. And if he's healthy all year, he's worth taking number 1 overall or number 2 overall. If you have any questions, there's a lot of other options that you can take if you have that 1st or 2nd pick. And then obviously my top dog, Austin Eckler. He was the leader for running backs last year in fantasy. That does not always mean it will translate to the next year. But what I love about him is he's fully aware of fantasy football. He addresses it with his fans. He plays fantasy football. He drafts himself. He's very competitive. He's got the underdog mentality. And the Chargers throw the ball to him, I kid you not, like 7-8 times a game. And he, Justin Herbert, like I said with Burrow and Mixon, and like I said with Tom Brady all those years, he will hit his check down. He will not take sacks. If you take away the vertical passing game, they'll make you pay. So I really like Eckler because of those targets in a PPR league, but also he's a tough guy to tackle, and he hit some home runs last year as well. And he was the top running back last year. I anticipate that happening again this year.
Yeah. Obviously, you're going to see a lot of similarities between my list and Mark's list. And if I remember correctly, tight ends is also pretty similar as well. But that's what we have sleepers and rookies for, to get a little bit more variety in there. But yeah, really agree with your list and a lot of your talking points. So I'll kind of keep mine short and sweet. Quick reminder, this is mostly with PPR in mind. I think these lists carry weight if you're not running PPR too, but PPR by far and away is the more popular, format. So, and I believe that's what both Mark and I play. So that's what we're kind of gauging these lists off of. Number 5 for me is Austin Eckler. He was my number 1 last year, and he dropped down to 5 for me just because of the fact that I have some questions about the Chargers offensive line. They've added some receiving weapons, and he's also, shown to be a little bit disgruntled. He asked for a trade that kind of quieted down. I don't know what the situation's going to be with that. But, generally, if there's, some issues there, sometimes that does result in a little less playing time. So I'm just going into some of those things a little bit more cautious. I still think he's going to be a top 5 running back in the fantasy football world, though. Number 4 for me, Saquon. Him and CMC, it's a similar situation, right? I've kind of steered clear of these guys due to injury the past couple of years. If I remember correctly, actually, CMC was on neither Mark nor I's list last year for top 5 because of how bad the injury problems were. I think the transition to being on the 49ers, right, which has meant, not only better offensive line play, but they have so many weapons that I don't think CMC's put in these positions where he's, got to be a workhorse and getting tackled as frequently has helped that as well. And honestly, same thing with Saquon, right? The Giants have invested in their offensive line, and we'll kind of see how, Daniel Jones and the receiving core complements, but just, bundling those two together, I think both of them, right? PPR league, their catching ability, their speed, they're both huge for fantasy for that reason.
Also, Saquon has a lot of incentives in his contract. If you're ever having questions, look for guys that have incentives in their contract. If he balls out with wins and yards and touchdowns, he gets more money. So yeah, you always got to look out for that too.
Definitely something to look out for. 2 for me is Tony Pollard for all the same reasons that Mark mentioned. I think with Zeke gone, he's going to be getting, not only his fair share of runs, but also probably a decent amount of targets in the receiving game. Obviously carries a lot of weight in a PPR league. And I mean, we've seen what he's done the past couple of years here. I think he's, he's still very young, incredibly effective, incredibly fast. I think he's going to be huge. Then number 1 for me, who I think was number 2 last year, is Nick Chubb again. Look, injury, he hardly has injury issues. He has huge freaking legs, can run through people, get, extra yards, break tackles. Like, he was exactly what I was expecting him to be last year. And I think he's going to be exactly the same this year. He is just a very reliable running back. He might miss out on some of that PPR potential that some of the other guys on this list are. But if you're just looking for a dude that's going to be a staple, always be good for, say 10 to 15 points every single week, I personally favor consistency, right? I'm not looking for the guys that give me 30 points, 2 weeks out of the season and then they suck the rest of the season. I like guys that give me above 10 points week in and week out because I know what to expect. And Chubb's that guy. And he was that guy for me last season. And, him and Pollard were my 2 top running backs. They were both on my roster last year. I don't know if I'll get so lucky this year, but they were both on my roster last year.
Another thing with Pollard too is those short yardage touchdowns that Zeke would normally steal because he's just a fat ass, and they'd put him in there like, hey, go get your touchdown because they're paying all this money and the fans want to see you do the eat thing and jump in the State Farm, bowl. Tony Pollard will get those now. So you'll see some more touchdowns, I think, out of Pollard on the short yardage stuff.
Yeah. So definitely, like, I'm feeling pretty confident that Chubb and Pollard are going to be huge this year, just as they were last year. Like I said, that's a huge reason I attribute the fantasy success that I had last year was because those 2 guys were on my roster, struggling with running back depth. I was happy that I shored that up early, and we'll kind of get into that when we discuss strategy later in the conversation. So any other comments on running backs before we move on here?
No, I mean, I think, generically, obviously we'll get more into this strategy towards the end, but be careful. The running backs typically go pretty quick. You want to make sure that especially if you're in a PPR, look for guys that get targets out of the backfield. Those are easy, cheap points to get. And obviously you always have to weigh in the running back by committee and the injury concerns with all of these guys.
Yes, sir. All right. Wide receiver, Mark, take it away.
All right. So starting at number 5 again, working our way up. So at 5, I have Calvin Ridley. Now, if you've been following this podcast for any amount of time, you've seen that I've been pretty high on him since he's been in Jacksonville. The reason for that is obviously he had a year off last year due to a gambling suspension. This year, I made a kind of a joke that he's betting on himself. I think he's hungry. He's coming out trying to prove people wrong. And he's got Trevor Lawrence as his quarterback, and he has Doug Peterson, and he has a good tight end and receivers and running backs around him. So it's hard to just, focus on him. I think he's one of the best route runners in football. I think he's got some of the best hands in football, and he has, like I said, a hell of a quarterback and a hell of a play caller. So they're going to find ways to get creative and get him open, and he's a playmaker. In Atlanta, if you guys remember a few years back with Matt Ryan as his quarterback, he was like one of the top 3 or 4 receivers. I do anticipate him being a top 5 fantasy football receiver this year. And I think you could probably get him in like 3rd or 4th, maybe even 5th round of drafts this year. So kind of a sleeper in that sense, but also I do think he's a legitimate like top 5 receiver to pick. I think he'll be awesome. At 4, I have CeeDee Lamb. The Cowboys have brought in a couple of their weapons to go around CeeDee Lamb, which some people can see that as a downfall. I see that as an advantage. I think CeeDee Lamb, now that you have a guy like Brandon Cooks, take the top off of defense, CeeDee Lamb's going to be that slot receiver. He's going to get a majority of the targets. Again, one of the best route runners in football, has after the catch ability. He's a touchdown machine. He's a big play machine, and Dallas loves him, and they love to give him the ball in a lot of creative ways. I just think that this guy, year in, year out, has been consistent in putting up big fantasy numbers. He's never truly been considered a top 5 guy. I think this year he is. At 3, I have Tyreek Hill. Simple thing, fastest guy in football. There is no matchup that is not favorable for him. Any kind of matchup that is not 2 guys on him is a win for him. And we saw what he did last year when Tua was healthy. You pair him with Jalen Waddle, who's another guy we'll talk about. Those 2 dudes, you can't double both of them. And whoever you don't double is going to have a big day. And even if you do double him, we've seen him run by 2 guys before. So Tyreek Hill, consistent home run guy, consistent big play guy, and he's going to get a shit ton of targets. And with Tua healthy again, and with Mike McDaniel and what they're doing offensively, I love it. 2, I have Cooper Kupp. Injured last year early in the season, but if you remember before that, he was the leading fantasy points getter in his, I don't know how many games he played. I want to say it was 4 or 5 games. He was
won the Triple Crown, you know.
Yeah, the year before that won the Triple Crown. Then last year played 5 games, was by far the leading points getter as for receivers, and I think just flat out the #1 fantasy player through the first 5 weeks. He's a stud, man, and he's really the only consistent weapon the Rams have on that roster. Him and Stafford clearly have a great connection and great chemistry. I don't think the Rams are going to be very good, which means they'll be playing from behind a lot as well. Cooper Kupp's a guy that's not ever going to quit. He's going to continue to work, even if they are losing games. Stafford's kind of the same way as well. They don't have a quit in them. So if he remains healthy, which I think he will, he's going to be one of the top guys. Very, very, very hard to game plan against. Now, I will say, because of how weak they are around him, he might be getting a ton of attention in terms of double coverage, bracket coverage, but I've seen him pick those apart as well. So, and Matt Stafford's not afraid to throw in a double coverage. We've seen him do it forever with Megatron. And then the top guy, I don't think anyone can argue it right now, is Justin Jefferson. Now, I have some concerns with him. Some people say you could draft this guy #1 overall. I wouldn't. He's been the top receiver in fantasy, I think, 2 years in a row. And the thing is, when that happens and everybody knows his production, you're going to try to do anything you can to take him out of the game plan. John, there's a clip in the film, if you want to pull it up, of what the Packers did to Justin Jefferson, and they held him to, like, I think under 40 yards and maybe 3 or 4 catches. This is the kind of stuff I think is going to happen a lot, which is why you have to look out for like Jordan Addison as another sleeper. We'll get into him as well. That's
double Justin. Oh yeah, is this what you were talking about?
No, there's a clip of the pack right here. Yeah. So you can kind of see the Packers did this pretty much the whole game. You have the best defender on the Packers roster in Alexander, pressing him, getting his hands on, taking him out of his comfort zone all game long. And then you have a safety that basically stands at about 15, 20 yards over him. And they did this no matter what. Like, you can see that guy's cheating to his side.
Right.
Consistently. So they're not, and I think more teams will do this kind of thing because he's that good. And so at that point, in fantasy purposes, the Vikings offense, weapons around him like Hawkinson, like Jordan Addison, are good pickups. But Justin Jefferson's going to get his targets, man. He's going to make plays in double coverage, single coverage. It's just, I don't know if he has as big of a year as he's had the last couple of years, numbers-wise, because everybody and their brother knows what the Vikings are trying to do. Yeah. So now they do get creative in how they get him the ball and stuff, especially down the red zone. I think he got tackled last year 7 times on the 1 yard line, which is unfortunate for owners of Justin Jefferson in fantasy. But yeah, I mean, you can't argue. I think he's the top guy.
Yeah. So my list here, number 5, Amon-Ra St. Brown. I think, there's probably a little bit more hesitation around this pick last year, just because of the fact that nobody really knew if his production at the end of the season prior was a fluke or not. Clearly it wasn't. One of the hardest workers in football, one of the best hands in football, and wide receiver number 1 in Detroit. But the nice part is it's not because of his ability to take the top off or because he has insane speed or anything like that. It's because he is deadly in the middle of the field, which means a lot of targets, a lot of receptions. If you're in a PPR league, that's really good news, right? I mean, you know, you consider the fact that he was getting like 8 or 9 receptions per game last season. And then, right, that's 9 points, not including the yardage, right? If you're in a PPR league. So definitely way up there on my list, a lot more than he was in prior years. Number 4 is AJ Brown. He was not on my list last year because we had, you know, same thing, a lot of uncertainty around the Eagles. It's clear to me that their offense is a well-oiled machine that is going to be very difficult to be stopped. The only hesitancy that I had around putting him here is just how many weapons are on the Eagles offense. The ball is going to get spread around a little bit, but kind of as Mark said, you know, that's probably an advantage, honestly, because of the fact that he's not going to be getting double covered or anything like that. And same situation where, you know, he's really damn good in the middle of the field, which usually means a lot of targets. 3 for me, Jamar Chase. Look, simply put, Joe Burrow's #1 receiver, #1 target. And he's got a lot of help too. So I think he's going to rack up a lot of fantasy points, and very similar argument goes for Stephon Diggs. Added chip on his shoulder, I think, based off of kind of some of the actions we've seen with training camp and things like that. I think he feels, you know, not only a lot of pressure, but a lot of motivation to perform. Josh Allen, you're being your quarterback, helps quite a bit. And I don't think Josh Allen's going to be running quite as much as he was last year. And so for that reason, I think that he's actually probably going to be a top 5 receiver in the league this coming season. Then same as Mark, #1, Justin Jefferson. As Mark said, I would probably advise taking him, you know, first overall, or advise against taking him first overall or something like that. This is kind of a weird year where, you know, I don't really want to be picking first, second, third, fourth, or fifth or anything like that this coming season, because I just don't think there's really that many guys that are just like so far above everybody else as far as production that I think that's worth it. With that being said, I mean, like I said, this is the closest thing I've seen to a player that reminds me of Calvin Johnson since Calvin Johnson retired. He is a guy that you need to literally dedicate 2 defensive players to covering him damn near all the time.
And even then, we've seen him make, like, the Lions,
Exactly.
you know, in the Lions game, I have nightmares of just bracket coverage. He runs a corner out. He makes a great adjustment on the ball, catches it, makes a guy miss, stays in bounds and scores. They ruled him out of bounds. He was not.
He's incredible, and he catches everything that comes his way. I mean, the speed, the size, the hands, he is the best wide receiver in the NFL, if you ask me, and I think that's going to show up in fantasy production. All right, tight ends. Again, Mark and I have pretty similar lists here, but with that being said, go ahead and take it away.
It's so funny too, John, because as we're doing this, I just got a text from a good friend of the show, Caleb Kalenko. He's texting me about who to pick second overall in fantasy. And it's just like, here comes the advice pick, which, by the way, I'm in a league with him, and like, I don't know why he's seeking advice from me. Obviously it's for a different league, but just
that is funny.
Just goes to show you can trust our opinions, because even our closest friends are asking us behind
in
the
our
scenes
leagues who we're competing against.
Yes. But let's get into tight ends. Listen, tight ends, in terms of an overview of the position, there's a huge fall off, right? Your top 2, 3 of them, and then there's a big fall off, and then after like the next 4 or 5, huge fall off. So how you choose to draft these guys and when you choose to, I would go earlier and try to get one of those very best, because also they have great trade value because there's so few of the great ones. But I'll start with number 5 and work my way up. And honestly, there's not many tight ends past like the 7 or 8 on the top, 7 or 8 that are worth having in fantasy.
And we're gonna have sleepers though. So
yeah, for sure we'll have sleepers.
And
there's no doubt some guys that you can have on your team that will make a difference, but after those sleepers, I'm telling you, there's a huge drop off. So you want to get these guys early, and then if you do use them as trade value, a couple of years ago, a little strategy, a little insight, I drafted Kelsey and Kittle in, I think, the 2nd and 3rd round, and I ended up trading Kittle for like 2 top, a receiver and a running back. So like I was able to still kind of work my roster the way I wanted to, because again, if you kind of hog up the best, there's not many of them. So number 5, I have Mark Andrews. One of Lamar Jackson's favorite targets, has been for the last few seasons. I have him a little bit lower than I normally would, simply because I think he's one of the best receiving tight ends in the NFL, but they have OBJ, Zay Flowers, Bateman, all going to kind of take some of those targets. A new OC that does know how to use tight ends well. I just think that he might get a little less targets than he has in previous years. I think his production will be about the same, though. Again, you have to pick and choose whether or not having the people around you hurts or helps them. And there's situations where I think it helps guys, and there's situations where I think it hurts guys. In this case, I think it hurts them a little bit, but still a very safe pick, and he's going to be a red zone machine. Definitely a tight end you want to draft. George Kittle, I have at number 4. 49ers guy, loves to block, which I wish he got fantasy points for pancakes because he'd be much higher on the tight ends list for that because he's one of the best blocking guys at this position. But he's also a great pass catcher. He's a freak of nature in space. He's got strong hands. He's got great chemistry with the quarterbacks. Doesn't matter who the quarterback is in San Francisco. He's Mr. Consistent. He'll put up numbers. At number 3, I have Hockenson. You saw towards the end of the year with Minnesota, he became one of Kirk Cousins' favorite targets. Like I said with Jefferson in the double coverage and with Addison getting, a benefit of that, Hockenson also benefits from that. He's kind of that underneath guy, check down guy that is going to have coverage with linebackers and nickels most of the time, and he's just going to win those. He's going to win those matchups. And in this division that he plays, I like how he matches up against most of these teams. So you look at, he checks pretty much every box in terms of what we're looking for with those 3 main scoring system things we talked about in the beginning. He checks all of it. So definitely a safe tight end, and you probably get him a little later than the 3rd round maybe. And then number 2, a lot of people are gonna wonder why I have him this high. 1, he just got a contract extension, so there's no issues about where he's gonna be or his value or anything like that. He's a Jag. He wants to be a Jag, and they love him. So, and they're gonna use him. Doug Peterson loves his tight ends. He's very creative with how he gets on the ball. Evan Ingram is one of the most athletic tight ends, if not the most athletic in the league right now. Still very young, runs really, really well. Again, Trevor Lawrence is going to benefit. He's going to benefit big time having a guy like that at quarterback. And we saw some of the production. And again, you have guys like Calvin Ridley and all these guys around him. It's just going to make his matchup even better. I think that's one of those instances where it favors Evan Ingram. I think he's going to be a stud. So I have him at number 2. Some people might say that's high, but I really do think he has a huge year for Jacksonville. I just think Jacksonville in general's offense will have a huge year, explosive year. And then obviously the top dog, there's no doubt about it. You could argue this maybe even stronger as the top tight end at his position than Jefferson at receiver is Travis Kelce. There just is no one in the world you're going to find that can make a clear debate that makes sense as to anyone being above him in fantasy football. Matt Mahomes is his quarterback. He's been the top fantasy tight end of, I think, 5 or 6 years in a row. He's a red zone machine. You just look at the Raiders game last year. He caught, I think, 4 touchdowns in one game in a comeback win over the Raiders. The guy's just a machine. They draw up so many plays for him. They get very creative in making sure he's on the right matchups. They motion him like crazy, so it's really hard to bracket him. He's a machine. You can if you can get this guy in the 1st round, he's honestly worth maybe a top 5 pick. Probably.
So, because worst case scenario, which this happened to me one season, trade value, right? I had somebody give me a king's ransom because they, as you said, Mark, didn't have a tight end.
Huge value,
and we're willing to trade away for him. So I agree very strongly with most of Mark's list, as I have very, very similar list. 5, Evan Ingram, as Mark said, if you're taking a look at, our fantasy score that we're using, he checks really every box as well. His situation's great because it's an efficient offense that likes getting tight ends the ball. They're beating up on a very weak AFC South division, in my opinion. And he himself is incredibly skilled, athletic, great hands. So that one's easy. For Darren Waller, I think his situation is really the reason why I have him this high. I think with the Raiders, he had some games where he was hot, some games where he wasn't. I think he's going to be an absolute favorite of Daniel Jones's during the season. I've been even hearing some training camp stuff that they're purposely taking him out of practice because Daniel Jones is getting complete tunnel vision on him as a target when they're practicing. And so that all sounds like music to my ears as somebody that, might be looking to grab a tight end, maybe not in the 1st or 2nd round, but I think Waller will probably be there in the 3rd or 4th round. And I think that is a great option to take him with because he is going to get a lot of targets due to the receiving talent with the Giants, which there will be some discussions going on there when we talk about sleepers and rookies as well. 3, TJ Hockenson. As Mark said, between Kirk Cousins enjoying feeding him the ball, fact he's got great hands, just a lot of good things to suggest that he's probably going to be a top 5 tight end in fantasy this year. Two, Mark Andrews. I think his production the past few years has been too tough to deny. I do hear Mark's argument about the fact that the wide receiver talent in Baltimore's gotten a lot better, so he might get less targets. The other flip side of that is that might open up the middle of the field for him more than he's ever had, because a lot of the time, he is kind of taking those short yardage passes and then he's immediately getting tackled after, a 5 or 6 yard pass. Yeah. I think if they're stretching out the defense a little bit more, which is something that is a very new concept if you've been a fan of Baltimore, right? The idea that you actually have receivers that aren't going to, cause the box to get loaded because they're a legitimate threat. I think that matters a lot, and I think it's actually going to benefit Mark Andrews this coming season. And then the only
thing you have to think about too with Andrews, John, and that I agree with you. The middle of the field might open up, but it only will open up if Lamar is able to hit OBJ, Zay Flowers, Bateman on deep balls on the outside. If he's not able to consistently hit those guys, then it won't. So it's going to come down to Lamar too.
It's a good point, and I think that also shows our division and our opinions on Lamar Jackson and his ability to pass. And so you will, probably have a discussion there later in this conversation as well. And then, number one, Travis Kelce. I don't need to say anything that Mark hasn't already said. Undisputed number one tight end in the league, and after 5 years straight of that happening, you can start to say that this time is probably not going to be different unless Pat Mahomes or he gets injured or retires. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. All right, quarterbacks. And, we got a little bit more variety going on with this list. But Mark, go ahead and take it away.
Now, quarterbacks often get confused here when it comes to fantasy. Who are the best 5 quarterbacks? That's not what this is about. What this is about is who's going to get me the most fantasy points. Now, in most leagues, the quarterbacks' touchdowns and their yards, the point systems are different than like receiving yards and rushing yards. And, for example, a touchdown is normally 6 points for other guys. For quarterbacks, sometimes it's less, depends on your league. But what you have to look at here is opportunities to run the ball. Are they going to consistently put up ridiculous numbers in the passing game? And are they going to turn the ball over? Right. And also, what kind of games are they going to be in? Right. You want shootout games. You want, you don't want to blow everybody out. You want to be in these close games where they're consistently putting up numbers. You don't want teams that run the ball heavy to the running backs. So Trevor Lawrence is a guy. I think the Jags will throw the ball a lot, right? Doug Peterson, he likes to throw the ball. A lot of different weapons. They clearly invested in their passing game. They do have a couple good running backs, but Trevor Lawrence also has the ability to scramble and run. So I've added him in this list because I think he will get you some rushing yards. He'll throw for a lot of yards, and I think he'll throw a lot of touchdowns. 4, I have Justin Herbert. Same thing. Something about the Chargers wanting to throw the ball. They throw it a lot on 2nd and short, 3rd and short. They take a lot of shots down the field. He's got a huge arm. He's capable of that home run touchdown kind of play at any moment of any game. And they give him opportunities to do that far more often than pretty much any other quarterback in the league. And so I think for that reason, he's a safe pick. He's a good guy to have. Not to mention he also can move around and run. And he's been very consistent, and he's almost always in close games because for some reason the Chargers can't figure out how to just like put games away. So he's almost always in close games. He's been in some of the best games the last couple of years that we've watched, most entertaining games. And I don't know why. It's just something about the Chargers. So he's a good guy to have. 3, I have Mahomes. Mahomes is not going to look to run very often. He will do it more than other quarterbacks, but he's going to put up so many goddamn passing yards. It's ridiculous. And he's going to throw for more than 2 touchdowns in almost every single game he'll play. So very, very safe pick. You cannot go wrong drafting the best player in the NFL. At 2, I have Jalen Hurts, mostly because of the ability to run the ball, but also, like John said when he mentioned A.J. Brown, they're going to load the box a lot of times against the Eagles, and so that gives very favorable play-action matchups for A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, throwing the ball in the backfield to DeAndre Swift, guys like that. Dallas Goedert, another tight end. Like, he's got weapons all around him, and they're going to all have favorable matchups because of his ability and their team's ability to run the ball. So not only that's a double whammy with Jalen Hurts. He's going to run the ball. He gets those quarterback sneak touchdowns. Those add up. And obviously, he's going to have favorable matchups down the field throwing the ball. So I really like him in fantasy this year. And the number one, Superman himself, Josh Allen. I've been kind of off the Josh Allen wagon a little bit this offseason. If you followed this podcast last year, you would have thought I was maybe homosexual for him. I'm not, just for the record. But he's a great player. They run the ball a lot with him. I thought that the Bills would do more to invest in running game behind him. They really didn't. And so I do anticipate they're going to still use him to run the ball. Not only that, but they like to throw it all over the field. And Josh Allen makes plays and scrambles and somehow finds ways to find open receivers down the field very often. For those reasons, I think he's the top quarterback in fantasy. And not to mention, he runs crazy. He doesn't care about his body. Like, he's going to jump over people. He'll run over people. If it's, if they're on the 11-yard line and they need 11 yards and it's third down, he will do whatever it takes to try to get in the end zone. He's not going to run out of bounds. He's not going to, he's just a different kind of player that you don't see in the NFL very often.
He is going to have to chill on that a little bit.
I agree, but he hasn't shown any signs of slowing down in that manner. So
right.
I love it. He's a great guy to have on your roster for the combination of rushing yards and also just ridiculous amount of passing attempts.
Totally. I'm going to kind of breeze through mine because a very similar list. So the one person I'll talk at length about being the top 5 is Lamar Jackson. I feel stronger and stronger about the fact that the Baltimore Ravens are setting up a situation where MVP caliber Lamar Jackson is going to be back this year. I just think everything is congruent with that, with the new OC and his ability to actually scheme to Lamar Jackson's strengths, the receiving core makeover. I think all of it is going to be good for Lamar Jackson, the player, and it's going to be even better for Lamar Jackson, the fantasy player, because not only is he going to be using his legs just as much as he previously was, but he's also going to be passing a lot more and potentially passing a lot more in the red zone, which is good because that turns into touchdowns, which turns into fantasy points. So I feel very strongly about the fact that Lamar is going to be a top fantasy quarterback this year, and it's going to be a night and day difference upon his talent in the receiving game because of the fact that there are so many things working to his benefit this season. Justin Herbert, laser cannon of an arm in a lot of shootouts, what Mark said. Patrick Mahomes, laser cannon of an arm, best quarterback in the league.
A lot of shootouts.
A lot of shootouts, right? I mean, AFC West quarterbacks, I guess, in general, unless you're, Jimmy Garoppolo.
He said it in the quarterback documentary. He's like, hey, I have to keep it close. I mean, I got to keep the people entertained. He goes, I'm an entertainer.
I gotta love it. Josh Allen, and look, our rankings here are reversed between Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts, but I feel the exact same way about it that Mark did. And look, I mean, Hurts is Lamar Jackson, except there's less doubt and uncertainty around, the ability to run the ball and pass, because we saw it all season last season. And those QB sneaks, those 1-yard situations also work to his benefit because they did do that a decent amount in the red zone. And if they got to do it again, they'll do it
those
again.
quarterback sneaks, dude, he gets like 5 yards. Like, those start to add up. Like, all of a sudden, you're like, you look at the stat sheet, and you're like, wait, how did he have 16 rushing yards? He didn't even try to run the ball. And then you look at the quarterback sneaks, you're like, oh my god, he got like 4 yards of carry on his quarterback sneaks.
It's ridiculous because, like Mark said, like, you're trying to get like a guaranteed surefire 1-yard gain on those, and somehow it's between the offensive line being as good as it is and his legs being as strong as they are, he usually gets a good chunk more than 1 yard on those QB sneaks.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, you talk about Chubb and his weight room videos and his squats and what he does. Like, Jalen Hurts is a freak, dude. He puts up a ton of weight on the squat rack and he's a machine.
Absolutely. It's no joke for sure. All right. So look, not only with the fact that we had similar lists, but also with the fact where it's like, all right, no shit. Like, what are you doing for us here by providing, our top 5 guys at each position, other than the fact that, we are very confident about these people's ability to produce, guys that you should aim for, and, as maybe your first guys as you're picking to start your draft. But I think where Mark and I add a lot of value is sleepers and rookies. Mark has a pretty good laundry list of sleepers and a lot to back those opinions up. And last year, I was taking flyers on rookies like crazy last season, and it paid off. Guys like George Pickens, Garrett Wilson, and Chris Olave were all on my roster at one point. Wilson and Olave were studs basically from the start, and Pickens, he took a few weeks to get going, but he was regularly having 13, 14, 15-point games. He was, a really solid flex, wide receiver 3 for me. So I'm excited to get into this. And again, I think like this is really where Mark and I provide a lot of value is, you know, when you're in round 12, 13, 14, and you're trying to figure out who you want to pick and who's still on the board, maybe these are some names to remember.
And not only that, John, but to go off of it as we get into sleepers too, John mentioned part of the reason he had success last year was his ability to draft rookies in these sleepers. This is, and I back John, this is where you know, the good teams separate themselves from the great teams in fantasy rosters, right? Is where you get, because everyone's going to get a few studs. I mean, that's just how fantasy football is set up. You're going to get the best you're going to go. They're usually live up to the expectation. Very rarely do you see busts in fantasy, barring injuries. But this is where you're going to kind of get the core of your team and really where you separate yourself, but also how you use your roster. And, you know, I'll provide an example of a trade I made last year at just the right time. I was actually 0-3 to start the season. I had Cooper Kupp. He was the #1 guy in fantasy. I realized that I needed to make a change before it was too late. I was falling behind. And I traded Cooper Kupp for A.J. Brown and Austin Eckler, I think in week 4.
Holy shit.
Cooper Kupp got hurt the following game and was done for the year. And A.J. Brown went from being like, at the time, I think it was the 17th receiver. He went to being a top 10 receiver. And then Eckler went from being like the 5th running back to the #1 running back. And I won. I think I lost only one time the rest of the year. So knowing when to trade, how to get more value. Like, yes, you're giving up Kupp, and at the time, people are like, "Dude, you can't give up Cooper Kupp. He's the #1 guy in fantasy. He has like 30 points a game." You have to kind of see the bigger picture and realize that that's really hard to sustain, and that defenses do start to adjust eventually. And having more is sometimes better than just having the best player, right? Having more good players can sometimes be better than having the best, and that's where these sleepers come in. As John mentioned, having a lot of these guys, huge, because it gives you trade value, it gives you depth. There's injuries, the sense of security, matchups each week you can kind of play. You don't have to have the same lineup every week. You can kind of pick and choose based on matchups, on bad defenses, on teams that give up a lot of pass yards, a lot of rush yards, etc. So, you know, that's the kind of stuff you got to think about when you're drafting. And so let's get in these sleepers, man.
Yeah, and I'll start it off, and we'll, you know, kind of go pie position and just go back and forth here. So running back sleepers for me, you know, Breece Hall, I think, is one that people are going to kind of forget that he was tracking towards like offensive rookie of the year, probably best rookie running back last year, because unfortunately he did have a season-ending knee injury. But I think he's going to be back in full force this year with an improved offensive line, with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. I mean, that's going to open up so many opportunities for him. I think he's going to be, you know, he might not be a top 5 running back, but man, if you feel like you missed out on the top dogs, I think he's a pretty safe pick to go with. In the exact same breath, you know, just like imagine, you know, what Jamal Williams did for the Detroit Lions last year, and then just place David Montgomery in that exact same situation. I mean, every short yardage situation, he does actually have some decent hands as well. Every red zone situation, like this is the guy that the Detroit Lions are going to be handing the ball off to score points at the end of the day. And we saw that with Jamal. I mean, he was a very average, maybe even below average running back that all of the sudden was scoring touchdown after touchdown after touchdown last season. Montgomery is going to be the exact same situation. And then another one is Brian Robinson, who, you know, missed about half of the season last year because he got shot and still came back faster than Michael Thomas did. Sorry, I know it's an old joke. He got shot. Yeah, awesome start to your rookie season. First game has even.
If a bullet can't stop you, like from playing, like, hey, I think he's a pretty safe. You know, don't have to worry about him missing many games. I mean,
definitely badass points for sure. Yeah. And when he got back, he was crushing it. He was playing really, really good ball for the Commanders. You know, I'd say as far as like adding scores to these guys, like, you know, Breece Hall, it probably scores, you know, like a 9 or 10 as far as both his situation and skill set goes. Schedule's probably a little bit lower. One of the tougher schedules in this league, especially considering divisional opponents. Montgomery, I would give, you know, probably a 9 or 10 across the board. I mean, for fantasy related perspective, skills totally there, schedule's totally there, situation is perfect. Could not be more ideal for a running back than the Detroit Lions. And then Brian Robinson, you know, it's a little weaker as far as situation goes, just because the Commanders aren't that good of a team with not that good of an offensive line, but I think skill and schedule probably makes up for it. So, No, those are my 3 running back sleepers. And now, Mark, you go ahead and say your piece on it.
Yeah, so I'm right there with John with Montgomery. I'm just as high, if not higher, on Montgomery in fantasy than John is. I think this guy has the potential to be the top running back in fantasy football this year, honestly. I know there's, and we'll get to Jahmyr Gibbs, a little sneak peek maybe with the rookies, but Jahmyr Gibbs coming in there, maybe steal some touches. But Montgomery is going to be, I think, the workhorse. I think he's going to be the guy that gets the short yardage, like John said. And, you can get hung up on the fact that, yeah, he's going to get those short yardage touchdowns like Jamal Williams. But Montgomery is he's so much better than Jamal Williams in every other facet of the game as well, that you're going to see this guy break long runs. You're going to see this guy have huge open holes because of this Detroit Lions offensive run scheme and how well they execute it. Like he executed it well in Chicago with a bad O-line. Right. So it translates really well. He's shifty. He breaks tackles. He's one of the best guys after contact in the league, and he's not going to see contact until about 5 yards downfield rather than the line of scrimmage in recent years. So he's going to do very well for Detroit. I also, a former Lion, DeAndre Swift, I'm very high on, traded to Philly as kind of a whole part of that, situation change. I think he's going to do really well in Philly. You have the threat of Jalen Hurts to pull the ball on all those zone read plays. And because of that, he's going to have very, very favorable matchups running away from where Jalen Hurts would be pulling the ball and going, because you have to honor Hurts' ability to run the ball. Not only that, he'll catch the ball in the backfield well. We saw what he did with kind of that running scheme in Detroit. The Eagles have a similar running scheme with maybe even a better offensive line than Detroit. And I think that if he stays healthy, he's going to be one of the top dogs. So I think he'll get more carries as well in Philly than he did in Detroit. Now, the one thing I will say that I worry about John with Breece Hall, and I kind of disagree with his situation a little bit. One, he's coming off an injury, so the situation, you never know for sure if that player is going to be the same. Two, there's a lot of rumors about Dalvin Cook and maybe a different running back coming in that could steal touches from him. And so that concerns me a little bit. Now, obviously, if no one comes into New York and he's the guy, he's a great guy to have. But if Dalvin Cook or somebody comes in, I would not pick Breece Hall. That being said, Dalvin Cook is a sleeper to me just because he's not on a roster right now. Obviously, he's not a sleeper player, but just the fact that he's not on a team right now, he will be soon. And whoever gets him, he's a great guy. And I think New York or Miami are the two kind of front runners for that. And either of those teams get Dalvin Cook, he's a guy you want to invest in on your fantasy team. And then my last sleeper for running backs is Dameon Pierce out of Houston. He had a good year last year, and the Texans stunk. I think the Texans will be better this year. They got Stroud at quarterback. Our friend of the show, Troy Harrison, was a rookie fullback. He's going to be better. He's the lead blocker for a lot of these carries. They have a great relationship. We've had him on the show. I'm sure we'll have him on again. But Dameon Pierce is a stud, and he's going in his year 2. He's had an amazing rookie year. I think he's only going to get better in year 2. No sophomore slump coming there. And they're going to lean on him because Stroud's a rookie, right? They're going to lean on their engine, and that's their engine. So I think you can get him late too.
Yeah, definitely. And I like all those picks. I think even if the Jets sign Dalvin Cook, that Hall is still going to get a lot of carries. But that's just me. And I think Pierce is a great pick as well. And I think he's a very underrated, kind of overlooked running back that is going to have some really solid production this year. I mean, he's objectively their starting running back. And Houston has its faults, but offensive line is, probably above average compared to some of their other faults. So,
and again, you can, like John said, he's their number one guy. If you can avoid running backs by committee and you can get guys that are going to get the majority of carries and targets and touches without having to worry about other guys coming in and stealing those points, those are always safer picks than guys that have other guys around them at that same position.
Now, one guy that you will see neither of us mention, which, was probably mentioned last year, was Derrick Henry. Mark, why is Derrick Henry off of probably both of our lists as being a guy you should target, maybe high up or early? Because for me, it's offensive line.
Offensive line's not great. I don't think their team's great. He's on the older side. He doesn't catch the ball in the backfield a ton. So in PPR, he's not necessarily a home run threat. And he's had some injury issues the last couple of years.
Yep. And I think all those compound into him, he's probably going to get picked too early in quite a lot of leagues. Yeah. And, it's just not worth trying to grab him in the, 3rd or 4th round.
Also, John, I do anticipate them being down in a lot of games. So
a lot of passing.
A lot of passing.
Yep. Okay, moving on to wide receiver. I mentioned this guy last year. I'm doubling down this year. Brandon Ayuk was really starting to come to life in the second half of the 49er season. He finally was getting, I think, his fair share of the targets versus, guys like Debo or, CMC or whatever. He's able to kind of physically dominate a lot of corners. And I think for that reason too, he's been a little bit more of a red zone target as well, versus, his rookie and sophomore season where he wasn't quite as high up there. So, I think situationally, it's probably not as ideal for a guy like him, just because of how much talent is on the 49ers. But I think his skill set really fits what you're looking for in an ideal fantasy player. He's got great hands, frequent red zone target for the most part. And their schedule, I'd say NFC West is probably like one of the weaker divisions. It's weird because 49ers and Seahawks are both pretty good, but I think the Rams and the Cardinals are going to be atrocious. So something to keep in mind. My next guy is George Pickens. I think this dude is going to be wide receiver number 1 this year for the Steelers. Him and Pickett clearly have some chemistry together. And on top of that, he is 6'3", strong as shit, great hands, incredibly fast. I'm going to be picking him, honestly, very early in my draft personally, because I do think he's going to pan out on being one of the number 1 targets for the Steelers. I think the skill set's there, the situation's there. I just think he's going to get a lot of targets, both, in general and in the red zone. And then last one is scary Terry McLaurin. And I think the biggest thing with him, honestly, is, the Commanders, right, team that's probably going to be playing behind quite a bit this season. As we kind of talked about when we were covering this division, what was it? Was it last week? Yeah, it was last week. NFC East was last week. And, he's just incredibly talented no matter who's at quarterback. He always finds ways to get open. I think he's probably a pretty good, mid-draft pick if he's still on the board for you.
Yeah, this year will be the huge test for him because I don't know if he's ever had a worse quarterback as a starter than Sam Howell. So if he still is able to produce, that's the true test. I like those picks. George Pickens, I like as well. I would also want to say Deontay Johnson's another sleeper guy that could be the number 1 guy in Pittsburgh. One of the better route runners in the league. Another guy that we left off this list, but with Kenny Pickett stepping it up in year 2 and having several options to throw the ball, he's another guy maybe to consider having late in the draft. But my guys that I thought of, and you might argue that some of these aren't sleepers. I have them as sleepers just because I think that I'm anticipating them going higher than most people are. So Garrett Wilson, probably a 3rd round pick, maybe a 2nd round pick in most leagues. I think that you probably might want to consider taking him in the 1st round. When you add a guy like Aaron Rodgers and he's the receiver 1, he's always going to have that chemistry. I mean, you see what he does with Devontae Adams. You've seen what he did with Jordy Nelson all those years. You see what he did with Greg Jennings. He just has a knack for making good receivers great. And you've already seen in training camp how they're using him. He's getting way better. We're going against Sauce Gardner every single day. He's not going to see many corners better than that week to week. So if he can get open against Sauce every single day in practice, I'm pretty sure he'll do a fine on Sundays against other dudes. And again, with a veteran like Aaron Rodgers coming in, with the new OC, they're going to find creative ways to get Garrett Wilson the ball. He's going to have a huge year. Amon-Ra St. Brown I have as a sleeper. John had him in his top 5. Well, we kind of agree on Amon-Ra. I didn't necessarily have him as a top 5. I think he has very strong potential to be a top 5 receiver, though. The absence of Jameson Williams early in the year, the ability for Jared Goff to use play action, the creativity of how the Lions get him the ball, a lot of double moves, a lot of short routes. He's got very strong hands. He's a great underneath receiver. He breaks tackles. He has some after the catch ability, and he's a red zone nightmare for defenses. He just finds ways to get open in the red zone, make contested catches, and score. In a PPR league, this guy just gets a lot of targets. So I do think his situation is hurt a little bit with the addition of Gibbs, because I think that Gibbs will take some of those creative reps away from Amon-Ra, and they'll get him the ball instead sometimes. But I still very much love Amon-Ra, and I think he's a 1st round pick. And I think most people would say he's probably 2nd or 3rd. I think he's 1st. That's why I have him as a sleeper, just so that everyone's clear as to why I have him there. I have Elijah Moore on this list as well. He's in Cleveland now, got out of New York. I think he's much happier in this situation. He might be their number one receiver with Deshaun Watson. I've seen a lot of clips in training camp that those two are connecting. You have guys like Donovan Peoples-Jones on the outside that will take the top off the defense. Elijah Moore will be that underneath receiver who will get a lot of targets. And he just didn't get those targets in New York. He didn't get to showcase what he can do, but he's a really good receiver. And I think people are going to forget about him. You could get him very late in drafts. And I think he's going to have a huge, huge value for how late you'll get him. And the last guy is Darnell Mooney. People are going to talk about DJ Moore. And it's actually funny that John and I have not mentioned him yet in this episode. He's in Chicago. He should have a huge year. He's the receiver one. He's having a great camp. Justin Fields looks great in camp. They have better offensive line. Everything in Chicago looks like it's shaping up to be better than last year. Darnell Mooney's still there. And I people say he's going to be the receiver 2 now. I think he's just going to be the receiver 1B. I really do. I think he's going to have a huge year. He had a big year last year as like the sole guy that they were trying to throw the ball to. He's freaky good in space. He already has the chemistry with Justin Fields from last year. And for a few years in Chicago, he's been their only receiver. Now he has some help, and he might get less targets, but I think he's going to make more out of his targets. So this is one of those rare instances where you add talent, around him, and I think it benefits him, similar to like what I said with Jordan Addison and having Justin Jefferson. I think DJ Moore is going to see a ton of attention, and Darnell Mooney is going to thrive in single coverage and double moves and play action. Justin Fields' ability to run the ball doesn't hurt. So that excites me. I think there's huge value for him late in the drafts as well.
I completely agree. I think all those are solid picks. And again, these are probably guys you can get in the middle rounds.
Late, man. I mean,
yeah.
Some leagues, Mooney might go like 7th, 8th, 9th round. Elijah Moore might not even go drafted in some leagues. Yeah,
a lot of opportunity there. And that's kind of the nice part about the receiver position, especially, which we'll kind of get into this when we talk about draft strategy. There's always a decent guy there in the later rounds, just because of the volume of wide receivers that are in this league. Tight end for me, I got 2 guys. Tyler Conklin, and look, friend of the show, but his situation could not be more ideal. One, he's shown to be, reliable, kind of experienced tight end vet. But additionally, if anybody's been paying attention in training camp, Aaron Rodgers loves targeting this dude. He's already building a lot of chemistry with A-Rod, and I think that's going to pan off to the field, right? The receiving core on the Jets obviously has some talent on it, but not so much where Conklin's not going to be getting looks. I think he's going to be getting a lot of looks. I think he's going to be a huge red zone target. If you don't get those top 5 or 6 guys that Mark and I mentioned earlier, I think he's right there with a lot of them. I think he's probably a pretty safe dude to take a flyer on overall. Next for me is Goddard, and biggest thing with him, honestly, is red zone targets. I think he's going to get his fair share of those. And also, he did get quite a lot of, targets, just middle of the field kind of slot, type situation as well. So both of those guys, I think, look, if you miss out on some of those top tight ends, these are at least guys that are going to, get you some points every week, and, definitely be situationally conscious on who they're playing, what the scheme fit is, things like that. But I think both of them are going to be pretty consistent, reliable.
Yeah. I also have Conklin on my, and, just to build off what John already said. Yeah. Yes. Friend of the show, former teammate of mine. We've had him on, we'll have him on again, but I wanted to be crystal clear that is not why he is on our sleeper lists. If I didn't even know Tyler at all, he'd still be on my list. Okay. Because Aaron Rodgers is a tight end maker. He is a tight end maker. Okay. You look at some of the guys, Mercedes Lewis, Tunyon the last few years. These are guys that they were not great before they had Aaron Rodgers. And the second that they had Aaron Rodgers and the chemistry got good, they became top 5 fantasy tight ends. Conklin's already established himself as a good tight end in the league. And now he adds a quarterback like Aaron Rodgers. And like John said, we've seen already in camp what's happening. This guy could easily be a top 5 tight end and period in fantasy. And that is not because we've had him on. It's not because he's a former teammate and friend of mine. I genuinely believe that. So if you can get him in a later round, which I think you will be able to, get him. And then my other guy that I have on here is Dawson Knox. Now, kind of a double whammy with Dawson Knox and the other tight end in Buffalo, Dalton Kincaid. There was some issues John and I had with sleepers and rookies. We wanted to kind of keep the rookie list, the sleeper list. Most rookies are sleepers anyway, because you don't know for sure what they're going to do. But Dawson Knox, he was my sleeper last year, and nobody really had him, high on any board going into the season last year, and he had a great year. A ton of red zone targets, one of Josh Allen's favorites down there. And I think it's going to be much the same this year. The only issue is I think Dalton Kincaid will take some of those targets. So, maybe not as high as I had him last year as a sleeper, but he's definitely still a sleeper. He's a very, very good tight end, and they will definitely use him.
Quarterback tight end chemistry is really big on that one too.
Huge.
I mean, I think Kincaid maybe is the more talented tight end, but Allen and Knox clearly had a bond last year. A lot of chemistry, not only on the field, but they're very good friends off the field. And Knox is going through some crazy personal shit and still had a very productive year. So hopefully, with that a little bit more in the rearview mirror, I think he's going to be locked and loaded for this season for sure. All right, quarterbacks, which is the one rookie sleeper exception. It's just because I had to leave it on the list that I could insult Mark later, but we'll get to that when he goes through his list. Look, Jared Goff, I mean, second half of the season, they were a top 4 offense in the league. I don't care, what your feelings are on Jared Goff, the quarterback, because Jared Goff, the fantasy quarterback, is in a very, very productive offense that has a very competent passing game and scores a shit ton of points. So
play action, big time shots downfield with him.
Yeah, and that panned out last season if you were to draft him, and I think the Lions offense is arguably going to be better into this season. For damn near the exact same reasons that I think Jared Goff is a good late round quarterback to grab, I feel the same way about Trevor Lawrence. Now, obviously, he was in Mark's top 5, so Mark has even stronger opinions on this. I think this offense is going to be really damn productive. One of the more slept on offenses in the AFC in general because of how much offensive talent is going on in that entire conference. But look, if they're playing the same way that they're playing in the last 4 or 5 weeks of last season, same situation where, he's going to be good for a shit ton of points on a regular basis. Tua, same situation. I think that, if you're playing with probably the fastest show on turf, I mean, between Waddle, Hill, the running back tandem, I mean, it is a disgustingly fast team. And with that comes, a lot of opportunities to score points, complete passes, all the stuff that Tua was doing, frankly, last season before the injury issues. And you just got to hope that the injury issues are a little bit better.
Are you going to trademark that, John? The fastest show on turf? Fastest
show on turf. Hey, if somebody hasn't already, right? And then Justin Fields, right? I mean, if you're looking for, and I think the quarterback yet to be named is probably selected by Mark for similar reasons. Not the best team, but can use his legs and is going to be playing from behind a lot. And I think even though there's going to be a lot of losses taken for the Bears, I think that Justin Fields is probably going to score a decent amount of fantasy points week in and week out because he's, in a situation where they're going to be playing from behind. He's going to be throwing a lot, and he also has the ability to use his legs, and he is very dangerous when he uses his legs, to the point where you do see him, house balls from midfield a lot of the time because, he slips one tackle and then all of a sudden he's gone 45 yards downfield for a touchdown. So
not many quarterbacks that can do that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So my quarterbacks, I'm really, really high on Geno Smith and you could get this guy late as shit, right? Because he was a top 5 fantasy quarterback last year. His offensive receivers, they got JSN out of Ohio State, probably the best receiver in the draft. I don't think you can argue it. You add that with DK and Tyler Lockett. All of those guys are vertical threats down the field, all of them. And so if you have 3 legitimate receivers that can take the top off a defense, I mean, it might be the best receiving core in football when it's all said and done after this season. And Geno Smith throws the deep ball just as good as anybody in the league. Like, that's what he's always been able to do. He did it at West Virginia with Tavon Austin. He's doing it. He did it last year with just DK and Lockett. Now he's got an extra guy, an extra weapon, and he has a good running game behind him so that play action's there.
Assuming they're not injured.
Right. And he can run the ball. We've seen Geno athletically in space, and he's not afraid to tuck it and get some yards with his feet. So I really, really like him. One of my favorite quarterbacks, and you can get him late. And
it's a great pick.
So it's a great pick. Jared Goff, for the same reasons John said, play action. He's not going to get you a ton of rushing, attempts or anything like that. But the deep balls down the field will be open because of how the Lions run the ball. He showed why that's valuable in fantasy towards the end of last year. Much of the same this year. You don't have to overthink it. I think he had the best touchdown interception ratio as well last year in the NFL. So you don't have to worry about the -2 points for picks or fumbles, takes care of the football and makes the right read, and he's, pretty good down the field. The moment that John was hinting at.
What the fuck?
Yeah. I mean,
the amount of hate you have thrown at this man over the past few months.
If you're not watching this on YouTube, if you're listening to this, a little slight drum roll. It's Anthony Richardson, and I hate him. I don't think he's a good player. I don't think he's going to make it in this league. I have been very clear about that. I think he's a bust, drafted way too high. He was not ready to come into the NFL. I think he needed more time to develop in college. For all those reasons, though, he's in my sleepers for quarterback for fantasy. Again, what did I start this episode off with saying? It was not ranking the skills of these players just flat out. It's their value in fantasy. This guy can run the football. There's no doubt about it. He can run the football with the absence of Jonathan Taylor potentially on a bad team that's going to be throwing for a lot and trying to kind of come back in games. He's going to have to use his feet. The O-line was not great last year in protecting the quarterback. I just see him kind of being an athlete and going into his instinct mode, which is tuck it and make a play. And similar to what we saw Justin Fields do with Chicago, I could see that happening with Richardson, where they're losing games and he's throwing interceptions. He's not, he's not good.
And that's what I was going to say.
He puts up numbers.
But what if he puts up 14 freaking interceptions up on the season? That's where my concern's at. So
where quarterbacks really, really separate themselves is the rushing yards. There's not many of them. I mean, you saw what happened last year with Justin Fields in fantasy football. The guy wasn't even on most people's rosters. He wasn't even on any team. And all of a sudden he starts tucking the ball and running. And it's like having a third running back in your roster without using it as a flex. It's a cheat code. If you can get a running quarterback that is going to, those points add up easier than passing yards and passing touchdowns. So if you can get a guy that's a true running threat, and I think Anthony Richardson is going to end up being just like Justin Fields last year, if he is the starter in Indy, which I'm still not even set that he's going to start there. But if he is, I do anticipate a shitty team with a quarterback that's like, hey, let him play ball. Just let him play ball, and he'll put on a show. And it'll be entertaining. We're not going to win games. He'll have some horrible plays that cost us games, but he sure as hell will make some exciting plays that give fantasy owners a bunch of points.
This is not John approved. Not John approved. But that's okay. I'll let you.
I mean, for anyone
who's a troll, this has to be a troll. Like you're just trying to.
I'm not trolling, dude. I'm just I think he has potential fantasy value as a sleeper.
We're trying to look credible. We're trying to look credible, Mark.
Just don't do what the Colts did. Don't draft this dude in the freaking first or second or third or fourth or fifth or sixth or seventh round of fantasy. Draft him late as shit.
I'll stop grilling you over this and we can move on. So here's just some other sleepers that I think we didn't mention that I feel like should have been mentioned at some point. We'll just kind of go down the list and share our opinions on each of them. Jalen Waddle, one of them. I mean, on the other side of Tyreek Hill, has Tyreek Hill speed. Honestly, could have probably been in some of our top five.
He's a receiver one on every other team besides maybe 3 in the NFL. It just so happens that he has one of the best in the league next to him, and they're super similar in how they play.
And that's what you're going to see with a lot of these receivers we're mentioning is really, really talented receivers that are just for some reason or another not wide receiver one on their team. Devontae Smith is another one of those.
Again, situation, right? You have to, like Devontae Smith, if you just watch him play, you watch film, you look at his numbers, you're like, hey, he's a great fantasy pick. I'm going to draft him in the first round. Probably shouldn't, right? Because of A.J. Brown, because of the running game in Philly. So situation is very, very important to consider.
Yep. So that's another big one. T. Higgins, right? Exact same situation.
Same thing. Jamar Chase across from him.
Tyler Lockett, Brandon Cooks, right? These are all guys that probably don't have ideal situations just as far as where their targets are going to be at. But, man, they're damn good receivers that are very skilled and, schedule dependent on a few things, right?
Oh, and by the way, there's plenty of weeks where Jalen Waddle will get, a lot more points than Tyreek Hill, or Smith will get a lot more points than A.J. Brown, or Higgins will have more points than Jamar, or Lockett will be the leading point getter over Metcalf and JSN, or Cooks will have a bigger day than CeeDee Lamb. Like there's plenty of games and plenty of weeks where if you put one of these guys on your, starting lineup, it's going to benefit you greatly. So it's not a bad thing to have any of these guys, and you can get these guys for incredible value, probably a lot of them in the second to fourth round range. And if these guys fall a little bit, grab them, because they're like receiver ones, but hidden. And get this, if anything happens to the receiver one on any of these teams, guess who becomes the very clear receiver one on these teams? These guys.
Yeah,
so,
all good points. Another thing to consider, just like schedule wise too, is, on the opponent that they're playing, maybe take a look at the corner talent on the team, right? Because if they're not deep at corner, a lot of the times the second wide receiver on the team will, exactly what you said, get more receptions, more targets, what have you, just based on the fact the matchup situation makes more sense to target that guy because the actual wide receiver one's locked down, right? And so that's very much something to consider. There's a couple rookies we'll even talk about that with. Question mark around this one, Jameson Williams, right? He's not coming back till week 6, so he might not even get drafted by some people.
Probably won't get drafted in most leagues.
And if he does, he's going to sit on the bench for 6 weeks. So it's something to consider. But man, he is a touchdown waiting to happen. He has the ability to take the top off versus basically any other corner on the other side. He is incredibly, incredibly fast, but there's a ton of question marks around how he gels with the Lions offense, how much playing time he's going to get. All of those things are definitely legitimate concerns. So, just something to look out for. If he's undrafted and 6 weeks go by and nobody's taking him off of waivers, maybe he's a guy to consider.
Right. Or keep an eye on him in weeks 3 and 4. And if you have a little extra room to cut a player and keep him on your reserve for, 2 more weeks, and then you're the guy that has him when he comes back. And if he does come back and play like, he's anticipated to play, he's a good guy to pick up, week 3 or 4 and have him. Because I do think he goes undrafted in most leagues.
Yeah. Aaron Jones is another one. He kind of had a down year last year. I just, for whatever reason, like the offensive scheme for Green Bay was not heavily reliant on the running game, which is usually a staple for Green Bay. But he is one of those running backs that has amazing pass catching ability. And maybe the situation is going to be a little bit different with Jordan Love playing quarterback rather than Aaron Rodgers, because I don't think they're going to lean as heavily on their passing game as maybe they were prior to. So that's why he's
he'll probably hit checkdowns more than Rodgers.
Yeah, 100%. Khalil Herbert, Mark, if you want to elaborate on this one, because I know you were more high on it than I was.
I mean, the simple thing is he shared time with Montgomery, basically like switched every other possession in Chicago last year, and now with the absence of Montgomery, you should see a huge increase in his carries. I also think they're going to probably have Justin Fields carry the ball less for similar reasons as we've talked about with Josh Allen, other guys try to protect your franchise quarterback. So I expect him to get a huge increase in his targets and his carries. And when he had targets and carries last year, he was incredibly productive. So he's a guy to kind of keep your eye out for that a lot of people are going to forget about because Chicago's not known for their strong running game and everyone sees Justin Fields as like their runner. But Khalil Herbert is a very, very good running back. And in terms of fantasy, catches the ball in the backfield too in a PPR league. Like he'll probably fall past the 5th round,
lower than that even.
Yeah. So, and I think he could be, a top 15 running back fantasy wise. So definitely keep your eyes on him.
Yeah. And then last is Isaiah Pacheco. I think just KC's situation, right? They've never really invested in a running back, and somehow they got lucky. And was he a 6th or 7th round pick, something like that?
I think he was 6th or 7th round pick.
Yeah, and look, instantly productive. I think that's having another year under his belt is going to be huge for him. And he is basically the top running back on that team. And while it's a team that uses the pass game a lot more than average versus a lot of other teams, that does not change the fact that he still is the #1 running back and can definitely see a lot of points, not only for carrying the ball in the run game, but also probably red zone situations too, if they don't want to go for, Kelsey or something.
And the thing with the Chiefs and the running backs is it's like every year they have like some running back, like Clyde Edwards-Helaire had a huge fantasy year. Last year, Isaiah Pacheco had a huge fantasy year. They had, who was it last year? McKissick, or what's #1 on their team? Is it McKissick?
I think it's McKissick.
Yeah. I forget his last name. He had like a 6-game touchdown streak, at one point last year. So they kind of like share the rock with their running backs. They're big on running back by committee. Mm-hmm. And then like, as you saw through the playoffs, they relied heavily on Pacheco, and like in the Super Bowl, he was their guy, and you rarely saw, McKissick in the game. So
yeah, they can be streaky, like you mentioned with KC. And that was the big thing is like, I had Clyde Edwards-Helaire during that big season that he had. And, some weeks he's putting up crazy numbers. Other weeks he didn't do shit. Right.
So and then the following year, a dud,
Right.
So it's like you just
dud.
never know with the Chiefs. That's why I have a little bit of hesitant feel with him, because you just never know what they're going to do at that running back position. They sometimes get hot with a different player and they ride with him. You never know. And also, they're not looking to feed their running back. They're letting Mahomes carry games. So
right.
It's
but you do need one.
You do need one, and whoever it is definitely a good guy to have.
All right. Kind of back to the format that we were doing when we were giving our top 5. But Mark, who are your top 5 rookies? If you
man, it's so tough because I really do like and compared to recent years, like John was pretty high on the rookies last year, and I wasn't. And there was a few that he absolutely hit on, and I think it's a big part, as we've said, as to why he won his league. This year, there's so many that I actually really like, and I think, again, these guys are all going to be available late in drafts, and I really think these guys are going to fit into their offenses and have an important role right away. And I don't think
I agree with you, but do not forget that there is risk. There's inherent risk.
There's always risk with rookies.
Yes.
There's always risk with rookies, but also, you don't have to draft these guys very high. I think a lot of these guys will be available late and maybe even go undrafted. And so that's a beautiful thing that you can get a steal without really having to give anything up. And these guys could have incredible trade value down the road too. If you do get one of let's say you draft a Jahmyr Gibbs and you already have 2 really good running backs in your team, you could trade him and get more receiver value or a tight end, right? So these rookies have potential and trade down the road as well. But I'll get into my list, and I'll say this before I get my list. I don't really recall a time where I've seen, in terms of like the skill position, a more ready to jump in these offensive systems altogether around the league than this draft class. Like all of these guys that John and I are about to name, like they're ready to fit in, I think, pretty well with these offenses and are going to have a role. And I don't think there's as much risk as we've seen in recent years. Like John said, there's always risk, but less than I've seen in recent years. So that's an exciting thing for fantasy guys because like we said, you can get some steals here. So at number 5, we've mentioned him, Dalton Kincaid. The Bills really liked him, got him in the first round. I questioned that draft pick. I didn't think it was a need for them. What I anticipate is they're going to use him more of like a slot receiver, and Dawson Knox will be more of their true tight end. But Dalton Kincaid's a matchup nightmare. I mean, he can run like a receiver. He's got the size of a tight end. They're going to, I mean, with Josh Allen as your quarterback and with Diggs and, Dawson Knox and Gabe Davis on the outside, like he's going to get favorable matchups all the time. He's going to have linebackers covering him. That's just unfair. He's going to, I think if they use him the way they want to use him, and that's clearly why they draft him so high, when other needs were probably more important to get, they really like this guy and they're going to use him. That's my gut feeling. And I like everything about Kincaid's game at Utah. And I think it translates very well into the NFL. At 4, I have Zay Flowers. Now, similar to the Mark Andrews thing, yes, there's a lot of weapons around Zay Flowers. Lamar's got a lot of guys he's going to try to get the ball to, but Zay Flowers, I think, arguably might be the best receiver in the draft. And just in terms of skill set, he got taken by the Ravens in the first round into a really good situation because he doesn't have the pressure to have to do everything on his own. He's got help around him. He's got a veteran quarterback. He's got a new OC that's going to benefit him in terms of what they're doing in the passing game. And this guy was a stud at Boston College, an absolute stud. So I compared him at coming out of the draft to like Antonio Brown, that kind of, that stature, that route running ability, undersized receiver that can just make plays. So I have him at 4. At 3, for similar reasons, JSN, Jackson Smith-Njigba in Seattle, the only receiver I think better than Zay Flowers, and similar reasons, right? DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, there's going to be other targets that are not going to go to him, but this guy's the best receiver in the draft class. And now he's getting paired up with a guy like Geno Smith, who can throw the ball downfield very well. And JSN's going to have matchups that he loves. We've already seen it in training camp, him going on wheel routes and double moves and inside fades and just using his speed to just get on top. And Geno's a great deep ball thrower. So I anticipate some big plays out of him. He's also good in underneath routes. At Ohio State, this guy was a freak. Okay. So I have him at 3. 2, I have Jahmyr Gibbs. Really, really like Gibbs because of the ability to do stuff out of the backfield and the ability to line up as like a receiver. So you kind of get a 2-in-1 for him because of Montgomery and because of what the Lions use, how they use these guys. I anticipate him to be almost like a Deebo Samuel. where he's a slot. He gets jet handoffs. He gets screen passes. He runs some deep balls. He runs a lot of underneath stuff, right? Little pitch and catch, let him make a play after the catch, right? Gets matched up with linebackers and nickels that just have no business trying to guard him in space. The Lions are super creative with Ben Johnson, their play calling, and I think they drafted him the first round for a reason. Nobody had him going that high on draft boards. I was shocked when they drafted him that high. And you better bet that you best believe they're going to use that dude and try to prove that pick right. You've seen it. Johnny mentioned the inside the den thing when they were talking about him. They're going to use this dude because they don't want to look like idiots for drafting him 18th overall. So, or was it 12th overall?
Yeah, 12th.
Jesus. Yeah, 12th overall. Okay, for the second running back in the draft. So, with all that being said, I do think he's got great fantasy value. And then the top guy I have is Jordan Addison. I hinted at it earlier. Jay Jettas is going to get double coverage. He's the best receiver in football. A lot of eyes on him, a lot of eyes on Hawkinson. Kirk Cousins throws the ball a ton, always in close games. He has these 4,000 passing yard seasons, like it seems like every year. And Jordan Addison's basically going to come in and replace Adam Thielen, but he's younger, he's more athletic, and he's more fresh. And so he's going to have great matchups with the third or fourth best defender on the other team consistently. And Jordan Addison was a Biletnikoff winner and transferred to USC and had another great year. So he's played in multiple different systems. He showed he can do it. I think he's going to have a huge year for Minnesota. He'll step right into that role as the number 2 receiver and thrive.
Yeah, I agree with all those. And, I just want to, I'll get to say Flowers, but with JSN, like the reason he's not on my list, honestly, is he is one of those situations where I think there's going to be so much, so little pressure on him to perform this season with Lockett and Metcalf that I don't think he's going to get the lion's share of targets. But that being said, he was arguably the most talented receiver in this draft class. So
he was arguably the most talented player in this draft class.
Yeah, so weigh those options accordingly. And similar goes with Zay Flowers, but I'll describe,
And by the way, before John goes with his list, that was only 5. There's easily. I mean, I had to trim this list down.
We have another slide of some random rookies that we'll talk about, but I want to stick with our top 5 here for that reason. Jalen Hyatt for me, right? We talked about how the Giants, their receiving situation is rough, and that's one big reason why I had Waller as high as I did on the tight end list, where I probably wouldn't have put him there if he was still with the Raiders. And it's another reason why I think Hyatt might perform this year. I think he's going to get thrusted into a starting situation probably faster than he wants to be. He's definitely the riskiest out of the 5 people that I have on this list here, so take that with a grain of salt. But I do think that overall he's somebody that is probably going to start getting starting reps pretty early on. And what he does with those is obviously up to him. Number 4, Kendre Miller, who for me is, probably going to get really the reason why he's on here, honestly, is he's probably going to be the starting running back because of the Alvin Kamara situation. That suspension is still pending, but the court case doesn't look good. And I think that Kamara might get, between 6 and 10 games. Assault charges are one of the ones that the NFL does tend to actually, take legitimate disciplinary action on, apparently more than, like an egregious number of sexual assault cases or any of the other ones.
Hey, John, usually, what the difference is with that is normally those assaults get caught on camera. And
right.
It's on camera.
And that's exactly what happened is Alvin Kamara totally beat the snot out of a dude, and his defense was not great for why it happened.
Not great. Yeah, I can't really lie out of that one.
And, with how quickly running backs kind of enter the fray in this league because of the fact that, as we've had plenty of discussion about, they don't really get second contracts. I think he's going to be thrusted into a starting situation pretty quickly. So somebody to keep an eye on. Number 3, he was not originally on my list because of the fact that tight ends do take a little bit to get going. But news broke yesterday that their previous red zone tight end target, Shane Zylstra, who is the number 1 tight end for them after TJ Hawkinson got traded away, has a season-ending knee injury, unfortunately, which totally sucks for Zylstra. I think Mark and I were pretty big fans of his as a red zone target. But now it's probably going to go to the rookie Sam Laporta, who's gotten his flowers from all the coaches on his performance regardless. And now the guy that was probably starting ahead of him as a red zone target is injured and out for the season. So for that reason, I think Sam's going to get.
Can we show that play of him? I just love this play against Kentucky. It's gonna be towards the end of the ones I sent you, John. Right here.
There we go. Yeah, this place.
Laporte, like this is so freaky for a tight end. Catches a quick little screen, makes 2 miss, makes another miss, breaks tackle. Somehow is still up. Somehow is still
what
up.
The
Somehow
hell,
is
man?
like that is ridiculous. Dude.
And that screeches red zone target nightmare to me. I mean, like
that screeches anywhere on the field.
Right, middle of the field nightmare. Yeah, I mean,
I genuinely and I think he's the best tight end in this draft. The more I've watched film on all these guys, and I know I have Kincaid high, and a lot of people had Michael Meyer high, and a lot of these other rookies, but I really like this dude, man.
Yeah, I had him overrated just because of his size. When we did our draft special, one of the reasons, not that I didn't think he was good, I was just really concerned about his size as a blocking tight end, things like that. But honestly, the more that I've watched film and heard that his attitude about playing the tight end position and not being afraid to block the shit out of somebody, he does seem to have like George Kittle level pride in that.
Those Iowa Hawkeye tight ends, man. Not many guys haven't panned out from the tight end position.
I agree with that. And so I'm starting to kind of double take on that a little bit because of the fact that, while Mayer Kincaid might have been like safer prospects from an actual size perspective from what you want out of a tight end, I think Laporte as a receiving tight end is going to be right there with those guys.
I mean, look, he's so shifty, so strong, dude.
Yeah, it's and while we're here too, I also want to mention this because I'm going to get to Gibbs, but quote you said is, I think I'm playing a lot more receiver than I did at Bama, which was a prediction that I made a few weeks back, is that like with the fact that they're missing JMO kind of speed in their receiving game, they seriously might throw him out of like, not just like slot receiver type routes. I actually think he will play like a legitimate outside wide receiver just to F with defenses a little bit. So, as we kind of finish out my list now with Zay Flowers, I legitimately think that he might not start the season as such. But at the end of the season, I think he's going to be wide receiver number 1 over Bateman and OBJ for the Ravens. I think that everything that you want to see in like what in my head is Lamar Jackson's ideal receiver target, he has, right? He's excellent up the middle, is kind of like a slot, but he has crazy speed, runs super clean routes. I just think he's going to absolutely crush it. Again, might take a little bit to get going. I'm not saying that this dude should be a week 1 starter on your fantasy roster. I'm saying this is a dude that you should absolutely keep your eye on after, Thanksgiving or whatever, as being that guy. I think he's going to get plenty of targets, plenty of receptions, plenty of yards after the catch. And then number 1 for me, Jahmyr Gibbs, as Mark already alluded to, I think this dude is going to get used basically right away. And he is going to be more of a receiver, really, really good for PPR situations. He's going to be, I think, a week 1 starter. And I think that he is going to be killer up the middle. His speed is great. His hands are great. So for me, I'd say, there's no safe rookie picks per se. I think he's one of the safer ones just based off of the situation that he's in with the Lions. Moving on to just some other ones that I want to kind of mention. And look, I want to be real here. All 3 of these guys, I'm, a little shaky on. These guys probably will not get drafted in your league. So these are guys you can look to pick up off of waivers or things like that. Number 1 that I'm mentioning here, Marvin Mims. It's because Denver just had 2 back-to-back wide receiver injuries. Patrick out for the season, and why am I forgetting the other
KJ Hamler.
KJ Hamler just was diagnosed with a heart condition that's probably going to take him out early in the season too. It's going to take a month or 2 to recover from what I understand. Mims was drafted and might have to adjust quickly. So,
and he was a stud, by the way, in college, an absolute stud.
So it should be. Drew is now saying in the chat that KJ actually retired. That might have broke today. I'm not sure. No element.
I don't think he retired. I think he just stepped back from the game for a while. But you don't know when he's going to come back. Is my understanding of it.
Okay, I got it. Next I have is Jaden Reed, and I just think it's because there's a lot of question marks on the wide receiver talent over there, and obviously at quarterback too. I think that overall, like he could still definitely be like a wide receiver too on this roster. He has crazy fast speed. So that is one of the main reasons I think he might be like that take the top off kind of guy for them.
I think he might be the receiver one. I really do. I just don't know how good the Packers receiver one will be this year. You know,
right?
The question marks around Jordan Love. But I really do think he could be the receiver one.
Yeah, and then last is Michael Mayer. And look, my biggest question mark is his situation. I do not think the Raiders are going to be very good this year. And with the quarterback situation, with the complete makeover on a lot of parts of the team, I'm just not sure. One upside is obviously he's playing with Devontae Adams. That's going to take some pressure off of him because it's going to be going on to covering Devontae. It might open up certain parts of the field for him. But again, like all three of these guys, I personally have some questions about. Mark, I don't know if you want to, have any other additional input.
Like all rookies, there's questions. I just think with these three compared to the other list we showed of our top fives, there's more questions with these guys. And it's not necessarily these guys that are the question. It's more the situation. Rather, like, I mean, Jaden Reed, if you flipped his situation with like Zay Flowers, I would think Jaden Reed would thrive in Baltimore. But sure. It's just different, right? Like there's questions with the Packers, right? Like you said with Mayer, there's questions with the Raiders. And with Mims, there's question with the Broncos. It's not necessarily these players we don't like. We really do like the players. Their situations have, asterisks next to it. So
definitely. I feel much more confident about this list that Mark and I have put together as far as
all these guys are more ready to go, less risk. These guys have potential huge payoff, but not as confidently can I say that as these other guys.
Right. Again, like guys that might end up on waivers a few weeks into the season, where if you're, keep an eye on them, maybe look to pick them up, later in the season if you're looking to add some depth. All right. Then I think last thing is just kind of like drafting tips and team management strategies. I think there's a lot of things here that, have kind of panned out for Mark and I both in draft and how we actually maintain our teams throughout the season. So first one, and I think Mark and I both are kind of on the same page. Running back falls off incredibly quick depth-wise versus wide receiver. Same conversation we had at the beginning where there's only one or two starting running backs on every single team. And wide receiver, there is a bunch of guys that are all getting a lot of targets. It's something that you really have to balance. And for me, like, first round, I might not look to take a running back right away. I'll kind of look for best talent, in my opinion, based off of where my pick is. Second or third round, I'm usually looking for the best running back I can.
You gotta get a running back within one of your first two picks.
Sometimes I do them back to back usually because I want to shore up that position as quickly as I can and be like, okay, I have two guys. Because man, worst thing ever is when my team is rock solid except my RB2. Right. I'm struggling to find a good guy the entire season, and it literally F's everything up for me.
Right. And the one thing with that too, John, is the receipt. Like every year, there's fantasy newcomers that come out of nowhere that maybe me and John talked about them in this episode, maybe we didn't. Guys that are going to come out of nowhere, and at tight end, running back, receiver, quarterback, there's always newcomers. There's always the least amount of newcomers at running back. So like, there's always going to be some guy that you can pick up late as a receiver that can get you enough points to win. It's way harder to find that sneaky running back that kind of pops onto the scene that no one saw coming because there's just not as many of them. So you got to get those surefire running backs that can get you points. You can always survive getting some, average to below average receivers later in the season that maybe came onto the scene for whatever reason due to injuries or something where they all of a sudden are better players. It's harder to find those kinds of running backs though.
Yeah, that was my strategy the past 2 years, and I didn't regret it at all because, again, like I really felt like that was holding my teams back in the years prior where I wasn't doing that. So I'm just like, let's get that out of the way, make sure I have two starting running backs that I'm confident in and roll with that. Next one, kicker in the last round. And I put this one in here because Mark and I had a disagreement on this, but I honestly feel like, man, if you can grab a guy like Justin Tucker, who really is good for 9+ points every single freaking game, why not? Right? Because the other alternative is you get a guy, in the very last rounds, bottom of the barrel kind of situation, and that guy isn't contributing. And like, to me, it's like, I don't care about the position. I can care about how many points you're actually giving my team week in and week out. And if you can get one of those, top 2 or 3 kickers on pretty effective offense or offenses that are effective enough to just always be in field goal range and maybe stall out in the red zone. Like, in my opinion, consider that. I don't think there's any shame in drafting a kicker, higher than the last round that you're drafting. That's just my personal take on it. I don't know about
good
you.
kickers, and a little inside of that. Good kickers to get are one, guys with big legs, so like Justin Tucker, and obviously consistency, but also offenses that don't have good red zone efficiency. So, teams that maybe don't run the ball very well, or quarterbacks that just don't have a high execution rate down the red zone, maybe bad play callers. Those kinds of teams you want to. 3 is always better than 1, is what I always say. So if you get extra points, that's great. Teams that score a lot, but you want to get teams that don't finish drives.
Yeah, and there are definitely quite a few of those that come top of mind. So just, take a look at those red zone efficiencies from last season, kind of use that as a gauge. That might help you kind of arrive at which kicker is worth grabbing. Red zone targets is another one, right? Like, yards is great and receptions can be great, but at the end of the day, touchdowns for receivers and tight ends are 6 freaking points. So keep an eye on who guys like in the red zone, because, and we've alluded to this plenty of times throughout this lesson here, but what do you want? A guy that's going to have, 60 plus yards a game, or a guy that has 1 touchdown a game? Because those are the same amount of fantasy points. So just keep that in mind as far as, what a good player is versus a good fantasy player is, because Jamal Williams, is not that great of a running back, but he did have 17 touchdowns last season. And so he was a good fantasy running back. So I don't know if you want to, have any other sentiments there, Mark.
No, I absolutely 100% agree. You want to find guys that get touches down there. And I'll jump right into defense, John, because I have a kind of an interesting take with defense. I'll see what your take on it is. A lot of guys will draft a quote unquote good defense, or an aggressive defense, or a defense that forces a lot of turnovers, or whatever their reasoning is. Me personally, and this depends how you use your waivers and stuff, but me personally, I get a solid team. I don't worry about the defense. I'll get a defense late in the draft, maybe. And then what I'll do is week to week, I will look for the best matchup, and I will pick up. I don't care if a defense is bad in their first 3 games. If they're playing against Anthony Richardson, and in the first 3 games he threw 4 picks in each game, I'm picking up that defense and I'm playing it against Anthony Richardson. So that of all, in terms of matchups, and we talk about how important that is in terms of schedule, get a defense each week. At least that's what I've done in recent years. That is playing a bad quarterback, a bad offense, a team that turns the ball over a lot, because bad offense and mistakes on offense are going to get you more points defensively usually than good defenses, if that makes any sense.
I couldn't agree more with that, and that is exactly the strategy I've been using for damn near a decade at this point. Way back when the Jets were arguably the worst team in the league, I would just look for whatever defense was playing against the Jets every week, and they would be solid for getting me points every time. Interception heavy quarterbacks, inefficient offenses, you name it. That's how I run it, is look for the bottom 5 worst offenses or quarterbacks in the league. Look at the defense that's on the other side of that going into the week, pick them up off of waivers. That's
very rarely are you going to find a defense that's consistently that you don't, that you can just trust to leave in your lineup every week. I mean, unless the 85 Bears are, come out of nowhere, like you're not going to find many defenses in today's world that are going to be consistently the best defensive option every week. I mean,
last season, like Jets and Denver might have been the only.
But even they had games where, they had games where they gave up 30+ points and stuff
and then going on to quarterback, right? I think Mark and I both are in the same opinion. You only need 1 quarterback. There's 32 of them. Chances are you're in a 10 to 12 person team. That means there's 20 plus quarterbacks that are going to get you points just fine. That won't be drafted or will be drafted as a second stringer or whatever. So I think Mark and I both are in the perspective, like I usually don't look to draft a quarterback until like round 7, 8, 9.
And again, don't worry if you don't have one of those top 5 quarterbacks like we had on our list, because truth be told, the difference between what Geno Smith or Jared Goff's going to get compared to Mahomes and Allen isn't that drastic.
Marginal at best.
It's very, yes, those guys will get more points than those guys typically, but it isn't going to make or break your team. And it sure as hell is not worth reaching early on for one of those top 5 quarterbacks. Like I wouldn't look to draft a quarterback until 5th or 6th round.
The only exception to this is if you really want a quarterback that uses their legs. Those are the guys that do get, points in the high 20s or low 30s on a more frequent basis. Last year, that was basically Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts and nobody else. So, if you want to take one of those two guys in round 3 or 4 or whatever, if they're still there, go for it. Chances are some idiot will take them in the 1st or 2nd round anyways, and they're not going to be an option for you. So if that's the case, don't stress about it. Make sure your running game is shored up before that before worrying about quarterback or something like that. Because you never know when you'll need a flex at any position, but quarterback is really easy to figure out if you need
the easiest to replace.
The easiest. And then last one here, receptions/targets greater than yards. And Mark, if you just want to take the time to elaborate on that one.
Yeah, I think honestly, guys, of everything that we talked about in terms of this list, this is the most important in terms of really separating yourself with, especially if you're in a PPR league. Don't get caught up in, Jalen Waddle had a 200-yard receiving game, or, Jefferson has these 100-yard streaks. Like, don't get up. The yards are the yards. But what I focus on when you're looking at who to draft and who to pick up in waivers and stuff like that, receptions, and most importantly, targets. Because what you want to care about more is the fact that they're getting opportunities to get those yards. Because you might get 1 or 2 targets and have a game that looks really good on the fantasy stat sheet where it's like, holy shit, Jameson Williams had 100 yards and he had a 100 yards and a touchdown. What a game. I'm going to sign him. But what you might not notice is a guy like Khalif Raymond maybe had 5 targets. Maybe 2 of those were incomplete because of good coverage. Maybe 1 was a bad throw. But you see the targets are what matters most, because if all 5 of those are caught, I bet you he has more yards than Jameson Williams in that game.
Right.
And he has more opportunities to get yards after the catch and to score. So you got to look at the targets and the receptions more than the yards. The yards will come. They'll take care of themselves. But don't get caught up in the yards. And that goes for rushing as well, right? Look at more, hey, how many rushing attempts did McCaffrey get last week compared to Eckler, right? Is it worth me? Should I trade? Should I, maybe do I do a trade or not? If McCaffrey's getting more carries and maybe the first few games doesn't have the production of Eckler, but he's getting more carries and more targets, you probably want to have McCaffrey, So that's, I think, really important to understand.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you on that. Again, and especially, right, fantasy is a numbers game. You do not want the guys that get hot, a few games out of the season and then are duds the rest of,
consistency is
weeks.
Key, dude.
Yeah.
Consistency is key.
And so if you know that a receiver, a wide receiver 2 or 3 on a roster gets 8, 9, 10 targets a game, like you said, maybe only receives half of those, at least he's getting 8, 9, 10 targets a game. Those are opportunities to score points. And I do think that's valuable. So hopefully this was considered beneficial for you guys. We definitely put a lot of work into kind of figuring out our fantasy strategy and what guys we're looking for going into the draft. Mark, can we commit to a day, Thursday, Friday for the live stream for the mock draft?
I'm not sure yet. I have some stuff I have to figure out, so I can't commit to a day, but we'll definitely be doing one.
We'll post about it. We'll make sure it's
about it. And honestly, guys, too, like, mock drafts are great and all, and I always do some just on my own to kind of practice getting used to seeing where guys are going. But the best way to do it is to create your own list, right? By position, get a top 15 guys at every position, and then have, like how we had sleepers and rookies, have those kind of below there and keep your eye on those and keep your eye on where they are on the ranks, and, just have an idea of like, hey, this guy's probably not going to go for another 2 rounds. I really like him, but where else can I address my needs on my team before? Because that guy's still going to be there in a couple of rounds. Don't reach for those. Like, I hate to use this as an example, but like the Lions in this draft in real life kind of reached for the players they wanted. And listen, they argue that if they want that guy and they're happy with the guy, go get him. But in fantasy football, don't go reach for those guys. Those guys are going to be there, right? Go get something else that you might need, and then come back to that and be fairly confident that they'll still be there. And if they get stolen from you, it's unfortunate.
Right.
But
you have a list and you know how to adjust.
Right.
And that's really what the big thing is. And I think that's the best lesson in the mock draft is being like, shit, the guy that I wanted is gone.
Have a plan B, C, and D. Do not rely on one pick and then panic when you're on the clock and it's like, oh shit, I have 30 seconds to make my pick. And, the pick before me was the guy I wanted. And oh my God, what do I do? Do I go running back to my receiver? Oh my God. And then you end up taking the wrong guy. So have a plan, hey, if this guy gets picked, I'm going here. If this guy gets picked too, I'm going here. And always stick with that. Don't do what my brother did. Don't be drunk at a bar during your fantasy draft like an idiot and have auto draft pick you 3 running backs in a row in like the 5th, 6th, and 7th round when your first 2 picks.
Which brother was that?
Who do you think?
Twan.
Yeah. Idiot.
Nice. Yeah. Also would recommend against drafting in public because there's one year where I forgot that my draft was when it was, and that's exactly what I did. It was not a good season. Yeah. And again, like you run this for, unlike betting or anything like that, like you do run this for 19 weeks. So, make sure that you got, a situation where you're going to be happy with the people that you draft and you can actually pay attention and not push it on auto draft because auto draft is not going to do a good job for you.
No,
I don't care what the stats say.
And don't trust the ESPN or the CBS fantasy rankings. Use stuff like we said, take this stuff into account, make your own lists, look at matchups, look at schedule, look at situation. Don't look at just, last year he was the best running back, so I got to take it. Don't do that because they don't really adjust their rankings based on the stuff that John and I talked about today very well. I would say the fantasy rankings are way behind and are just usually not historically accurate going into the seasons. So
yeah, got to agree there as well.
Yeah, trust, weird to say, but trust us more as a source on this stuff than those bigger
source. Trust me, bro.
Just trust it.
Thank you guys for tuning in. This was a longer episode, but hopefully, again, valuable information. Make sure to follow us on all the social media down below. Check out our merch store. Join our Discord. Remind Mark to take the ACT in September. All that good stuff. If you're a new fan, Mark got the Lions over under total wrong in a bet against me and now has to take an exam for high schoolers this fall as a punishment. So yeah, guys, we'll see you for the live stream. We'll again blast out when that's going to happen. It should be a good time. We like doing live stuff because we can see the comments come in, as we're hanging out, and that's always a lot of fun interacting with what people have to say. So we're looking forward to it. We will be back.
Season is almost here, John. It's getting closer. We're talking fantasy drafts. We're talking team breakdowns, film breakdowns.
On that note,
here,
AFC West next week.
I'm down.
Let's do it. AFC West will be our division for next week, and then that means NFC West for the week after. So we're looking forward to it. You'll see you guys for the live stream and then some more divisional content soon. Peace.
Deuces.